The Myth of Democracy by Tage Lindbom. First a quote from Hegel. The owl of Minerva flies at nightfall. End quote. Who will rule, God or man? This is the great constitutional question of human existence. This is the question that determines everything in mortal life, and especially and most acutely our social arrangements. Times of faith give way to times of unbelief. Times of obedience, harmony, and resemblance to our prototype are replaced by times of disobedience, rebellion, and denial. The perennial question is always whether we humans are to understand our presence on this earth as a vice-regency or trusteeship under the mandate of heaven and the divine commandments, or whether we must strive to emancipate ourselves from any higher dominion, with human supremacy as our ultimate aim. This conflict is already evoked in the fall. The serpent's promise to primordial man has a twofold content. By eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and thereby defying the divine commandment, man will emancipate himself from dependence on heaven and will at the same time win the promise to become like God, knowing good and evil. With this dual content of the fall, to be free of contingent nature, which is ineluctably dependent on heaven, and to become equal by gaining a knowledge that belongs solely to the divine, we can perceive the contours of the city of man. These two fundamental ideological archetypes, liberty and equality, are now formulated and expressed. But the fall also has a double content in a purely cognitive sense. The tree of knowledge attracts not only by yielding enhanced mental capacity, its succulent fruit also gives sensual pleasure. The fall thereby links two central powers of the human nervous system, the cerebral and the instinctive. These two ideological prototypes, like the two faculties of rationalism and sensualism, indicate the essential elements in the process that we call secularization, a process having the earthly and horizontal, the one-dimensional, as lodestar. As a consequence, they comprise a tendency to deny the hierarchical and the celestial. Secularization also brings with it progressive terrestrial conquests that have as their aim the enhancement of human power. We therefore add to the two prototypes, liberty and equality, a third element, terrestrial power. In Judeo-Christian civilization, it is possible to regard the process of secularization as a continuous dialogue between the heavenly and the earthly, between the spiritual and the sensory orders, between the intellective and the rational. It is always possible for the city of man to challenge and defy the city of God by scientific and technological progress and achievement. The Old Testament tells of the Tower of Babel and presents the art of brickmaking as an important technological means for the realization of chimerical enterprises. The scriptures tell of spiritual consequences. In the history of the modern West, secularization gains its first foothold in the High Middle Ages, when Aristotelian logic and natural philosophy intrude into the Western worldview. An important step in this direction occurs in the 13th century, when the English Franciscan monk Roger Bacon affirms that mathematics is a method whereby human thinking can establish mundane objective truth. As Prometheus had stolen fire from the gods and thereby threatened to bring about equality between heaven and earth, just so, through mathematics, it will become possible to gain a knowledge that is equal to divine truth. In the next century, there is an even more premonitory eruption into medieval Christianity, the nominalism of William of Ockham. Ockham delivers a telling blow against the conception of creation as a total unity, a macrocosm, by proclaiming that existence is a multiversum, that everything is individual, discrete, atomic, and separate from all else. Even God is not exempt from all this. Even he is una res, a thing among other things, and this means that God is separated from his creation. We humans experience the world through our sensory and mental faculties, and we believe that the resulting concepts derived from sense data provide us with real knowledge, and, Occam adds, as God is not present in the world, we can have no real knowledge of him, we can only believe. This represents a fundamental upheaval, a veritable revolution in medieval thinking. It is against this background that we must understand Martin Luther's sola fide, by belief alone. Only an ardent creed can overcome the void that Occam has introduced between heaven and earth. For Occam, the real is what our senses perceive. For traditional man, on the contrary, reality is a translucent objectivity. Perceptible through the world of sensory experience, natural things are lamps through which shine the light of their heavenly, ultimately divine prototypes. But Occam replaces this with a misplaced subjectivity, the consciousness that we gain through our sensory and mental faculties. The real is the evidence of the senses. Occamism informs truth or reality with a new content. It is this-worldly, subjective, gained by mental processes, especially rational and logical processes that depend on sense data. First the Renaissance, then humanism, then the Baroque. Here is the schema of a more and more profane conception of existence, an increasingly secularized world. Science, technology, aesthetics, social and political power, all of these become more and more the dominating elements in the consciousness of Western man. To be sure, all changes, most of which can be regarded as progress, can be considered in some manner as honoring God, as ad majorem Dei gloriam, but the Baroque state brings with it a wholly mundane notion of monarchical sovereignty. It downgrades medieval unity and its theocentric conception of power. Rational thinking becomes more and more the guide for worldly activity, and this tendency finds its philosophical perfection in the French thinker and mathematician René Descartes, who, in 1637, publishes his famous Discours de la méthode. Just as Occam's aim is to enlighten, to raise the level of intelligence, to inculcate proper thinking, ad excretitanda ingenia, so Descartes arrives at his pure thought. Descartes, like Occam, looks out on the landscape of natural science and regards the inquiring human mind, res cogitans, as the subject, which the object is the world of, while the object is the world of things, res extensa, whatever takes up space. Like Occam, he separates the creedal world from the world of positive science, the road of science being that of methodical doubt. And at last he states his great philosophical achievement: space and matter are to be declared one. Ratio, reason, working through the vertebral nervous system, now has its fully developed profane philosophical demarcation, and Discours de la méthode is the fundamental document of modern scientific positivism. But man also has a passive and involuntary component in his complex nature, and this is where he confronts pleasure, sensual enjoyment. Sensualism is brought to its philosophical perfection when, in 1690, the English thinker John Locke publishes his Essays Concerning Human Understanding. Locke does not deny that a higher being may exist, and consequently that a wisdom anterior to reason may also exist, but, according to him, We live on the earth with our sensory endowments, and we must adhere to this condition. Life is like a passage between Scylla and Charybdis, pleasure and pain. Man wishes and tries to avoid suffering, therefore life must be a calculation, with sensory delights as its guiding star. Pragmatically and empirically, we must try to find our way through life by continual trial and error. Man must learn to plan and to contrive, and thereby sensualism acquires a social aim. Fear and suffering must be eliminated not only from individual life, but also from the life of society. We can see the outlines of the modern welfare state prefigured in all of this. We might say, without undue simplification or distortion, that secularization increasingly becomes identified with two motives: the reduction of human intelligence to rationalism and sensual desire. The one is grafted onto the vertebral nervous system, and the other is a function of the involutionary and subconscious elements of a man's composite nature. Rationalism and sensualism will prove to be the mental currents and the two forms of consciousness whereby secularization floods the Western world. Human pride, superbia, the first and greatest of the 7 deadly sins, grows unceasingly, and it is during the 18th century that man begins to formulate the notion that he is discovering himself as the earthly agent of power. Striving to exalt himself, he begins to doubt and deny what thousands of years of wisdom have faithfully held, that creation as we know it is enclosed within the formal order, and that being bound to forms, it is intrinsically contradictory and imperfect. Yet man begins to believe that he lives in a world without confines, and that there are no limits to human power. In this growing narcissism, man and mankind appear as an abstract set of twins. The entire Western establishment, constituted through the labor of countless centuries, even millennia, and correlated with countless traditional ideas of value and principles of order, will, in the 18th century, be placed in doubt. First of all, doubt begins to erode the belief that we live under a heavenly Father who is both creator and legislator. The times are now propitious for a revolutionary change of scene. Part 2. The French Revolution of 1789 has one preeminent content: condemning the old traditional order. It proclaims a new structuring of human life. When I use the terms traditionalism and modernism, I am aware that I am using words and concepts. Both of these terms have many nuances, and both can be interpreted in many ways, but they nevertheless express two different conceptions of life and consciousness. Traditionalism is founded, first of all, on the consciousness of a higher divine reality, an immutable power determining terrestrial and sensory actuality. Existence in all of its multiform and inconstant variety is nevertheless a unity that includes all of the innumerable individualities that exist in time and space. It is an equilibrium that is neither chance, accident, nor chaos. Spiritual power dominates creation, and man is therefore subject to spiritual as well as to social modalities of being and acting. He is subject to both a spiritual and a social order. Every human being carries within his heart, at the inmost center of his individual existence, a spiritual and immortal kernel. Man is a creature of cosmic proportions, not in any hubristic sense, but rather in the sense that he lives in community vertically as well as horizontally. Traditional man has the capacity for an objective conception of being because in his heart he is conscious of immortal and objective reality. Modernism denies the traditional, first because it desires a free hand to engage in continuous change, which is usually linked with the notion of everlasting progress, a development that allegedly leads always to higher and higher levels. Hierarchy, authority, tradition extended in duration, and norms extended through society. All of these are regarded by the modernist as so many obstacles to historical dynamism and relativism. For the modernist, history is the story of rapid change in which all things are relative, and these he considers as permanently necessary conditions, necessary in order to open new and expanding fields for human activity. Instead of the immutably objective, there must be substituted a subjectivism that elevates man to the position of central power in his own conception of existence. Modernism replaces a perennial cosmic equilibrium with an atomistic liberty in a world conceived sometimes as a vacuum, sometimes as a field of exploitation for human conquest. Growing secularization has as its converse a continuous weakening of traditional values. The image of God in man is unremittingly attenuated, its contours progressively blurred. The role of the divine in terrestrial operations and events is steadily diminished, at least in man's consciousness. More and more he comes to think that he and he alone is sovereign on the earth. Finally, the power that dominates the world changes hands. Heaven and earth are now like separate continents. But even this does not yet mean that heaven must be denied. It means rather that earthly interests and activities now dominate men's lives and thinking, and that man becomes aware that human mental capacities and corporeal forces now wield authority. Continuous, pulsating life, constant change, uninterrupted progress, these are important elements among the ideals and values of that which we call modernism. And consistent with historical fact, we can say that the last decade of the 18th century brings us to the threshold of a fundamental change in outlook. Secularization has come of age in the consciousness of Western men. The image of the city of God has faded. The foundations of the city of man can now be laid. Life in the modern world is like a journey on a river, always providing new landscapes, always beckoning to new adventures. There is an important psychological factor to be noted in this new state of consciousness. For in our biological and mental life, there is always a menace hanging over us, that of sadness. Confronting this, modernism offers us a gift. This menace of depression and melancholy can be dispelled by activity, by change, by taking pleasure in change. In this way, modern man gives us a new concept, a new term, radical, because all of his strivings are directed to the left. The maxim of the French Revolution is pas d'ennemis à gauche, no enemies on the left. Men of tradition are now in a serious situation. They face the threat of exclusion if they cling to their father's creed. And no one has articulated this better than de Tocqueville. Such people, he says, fear being abandoned and left alone with their ancient beliefs. And in this dilemma, fearing isolation more than error, they join the crowd. Modern man arrives on the scene with an inflated consciousness of being sovereign over his own interests. At the same time, he is sensual even though he believes himself to be rational. Is this confusion sufficient to serve as a legitimate basis for his new sovereignty over the earth? This demand for legitimacy is important. An answer to the question grows more urgent. In whose name and over whom will modern man hold dominion, legislate, and exercise power? Can this modern man be trusted? Traditional man had the roots of his personal identity in the divine order. guaranteed by the Almighty Father, but where can modern man find a new identity? To say identity is to say origin, for the word identity contains an implicit question: from whence do I come? Traditional man can answer without hesitation, for in the certainty of his belief he knows that he has his origin in the Heavenly Father's creative act. Secularized man does not enjoy this certainty, even if he does not always deny its content. But paradoxically, this belief contains something that unites traditional and modern men. They both have the latent memory of a supernatural origin, of roots in beatitude, of a paradisal state that has been lost. Expulsion from paradise means entry into the profane world, with all of its forms of limitation, contradiction, and conflict. But this primordial state of peace, serenity, and freedom from conflict lives on in man as a memory. Thus man dreams of a lost paradise, even in socialistic and communistic speculations, Karl Marx being no exception. Man is a daydreamer. In many ways he moves in a landscape of fairy tales and dreams, an imaginary life that runs side by side with the hard brutality of life on this earth. He turns away from this ordinary world of conflict and struggle, this implacable labyrinth in which we wander, and he yearns for a peaceful and paradisal existence. Fairy tales and dreams can give what harsh, profane reality cannot provide. Unsubstantial hopes and fairy tales are a means to realize cherished dreams. Are these cherished dreams only an escape from reality? The question cannot be answered unambiguously. Traditional man is conscious of the conditions that inexorably govern creation. He knows that the world is filled with contradictions and conflict. He knows that this brutal reality is a consequence of his expulsion from paradise, and that this is his destiny. He knows that a dream is a dream, that tales are tales, that the world is what it is, and that man is what he is, potentially a saint, potentially a villain. Traditional man knows that he cannot dream himself away from his earthly existence. Secularized man, on the contrary, has lost this elementary wisdom. When he enters a world of tales and make-believe, the cherished daydream has a different content. Under the sign of the city of man, almighty human power will realize terrestrial perfection. For secularized man not only lacks objective consciousness of the world as it actually is, creation with all its limitations, more important, he also lacks a consciousness of the divine presence in the world and in the lives of men. He therefore senses an emptiness, a meaninglessness, and this stimulates him to give himself up to endless narcissistic imaginings and speculations. It is in these imaginings that daydream can replace reality. Traditional man, on the contrary, knows that the created world cannot become a paradise. But secularized man is enchanted by the dream that human power can eradicate existential imperfections. One form of profane speculation is utopianism. Just as the scientist, in his thinking and researches, elaborates models as a means of subduing refractory nature, so the utopian builds ideal models for a man and society, planning a complete profane order. During the Baroque period in particular, utopian speculations had their heyday. We must note, however, that every utopia is a static model and not a living and practically useful social organism. And further, utopian systems were not meant to be put into actual use. Rather, they were to be regarded as the sovereign's mirror, whereby the potentates saw the defects of their own regimes by way of contrast. Dreams and tales come and go, and utopian speculations make little if any contribution to the real world. The city of men, steadily taking shape as a gestalt, in the 18th century needed much more than dreams and fairy tales could possibly provide.
The city of man demands a constitution in a social, moral, and political sense. The elaboration of man's terrestrial power requires a higher imperative authority. It needs a constitution that renders man's self-promotion legitimate, that gives him a place in his own consciousness, that reassures him concerning his own identity and legitimacy. But secularized man is one-dimensional man, because he denies any higher divine power, and thus it is within this one-dimensionality, this horizontality, that one must elaborate on the new constitution. Essentially, the new constitutional order must resolve two problems. One concerns the emptiness we encounter in profane existence when the divine presence is forgotten, denied, or contested. And this vacuum, this absence of verticality, must somehow be eliminated on the horizontal, one-dimensional plane. The second problem is the vexing one of human identity. In this complex reality, man is simultaneously individual and transcendent, and this raises the question of how he can be at the same time both individual and universal. The constitution that is to be elaborated must rise above all earthly homologies, all worldly connections, whether of time or space. This constitutional system must be above criticism, must transcend all doubt, and must not be bound to historical processes of change. It must have a transcendent authority that, in reality, only the absolute can impart. An authority that will make this constitutional order immutable and universally valid. This means it must be a system with an authoritative power, which is possessed only by the sacred. This can be realized only in myth. Part 3. The Greeks have given us their name for the ancient concept that we know as myth. The Greek mythos means the word, the concrete authoritative tradition of a message concerning reality, a message having the gods themselves as source. Mythos is predicative, sprung from a divine source. It provides humanity with what is valid and normative for activity in this world, for ways of thinking, for the making of laws. For the Greeks, myth expresses the totality of being, and when Greek philosophy begins to take shape between the late 7th and early 6th centuries BC, myths still have this ancient meaning. In earlier ages, the Greeks included their Olympian gods and themselves in ontology, but the advent of philosophy and the philosophical manner of thinking means that they were beginning to depart from the ancient Oriental all-inclusive totality, from absolute eternal being and the implied beyond being. The journey of Helios is a non-historical symbol for the steady, unchanging order of things. But henceforth, the limited, the moderate, the temperate is to be the ideal. The boundless and unlimited is considered barbarous. The Judeo-Christian narration of creation and of a loving and saving God will be regarded as something absurd, quote, unto the Greeks foolishness, end quote. The Greek creates a myth about himself and his existence. The Aristotelian toon, being itself, is regarded as the ultimate, stable foundation and source, and this concept takes the place of the more universal Oriental totality from which it issues forth, without using the name, even without consciousness of the content of the myth. It is nevertheless this philosophical commencement that secularized man begins to seek. And later, when the modernism of the 18th century insists on a constitution, we encounter a flood of literature asking for an unshakable rock on which to build the city of man. From all cardinal points and at all levels, philosophers and other authors try to find something capable of filling the vacuum left by the denial and loss of the divine order. The perception of the cosmos. With new geographical discoveries, Western man finds so-called natural primitive peoples who are erroneously deemed to live without institutions, authority, or oppressors. Why not, like le bon sauvage, the good savage, live in the innocent bosom of nature? Another seductive notion is that truth is to be found like, quote, a vein of gold, end quote, and the hope of finding this, quote, vein, end quote, of truth gave impetus to feverish philosophical search. Economic life was another field of promise. Increasingly, men began to hope for self-realization from the dynamism of economic forces. But at the same time, ironically, among the so-called economists and physiocrats, we find the notion of an enlightened monarchical despot who rules the free economic forces with an iron hand. None of these dreamers, tellers of tales, and utopianists ever came close to the great creative task that loomed before philosophy, namely, to build a new city, to give this city an adequate constitution, to bring man up and out of all terrestrial dependency and bondage, and to give him a new, immutable, and universally valid identity. The one who comes nearest to success in this enterprise of providing mankind its new Magna Carta is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. A myth cannot have overmastering power unless it is divinized. It must be prior to all terrestrial existence. Such a myth must have its place in the primordial beginning of all things, in being itself, the source of all that exists. Only this sacral, axiological originality renders the myth unalterable and universally valid. Rousseau achieved this. He invented a paradisal state of origin from which this myth issues forth, and he calls this state of origin nature. Nature, for Rousseau, is the sacral point of departure for everything. In this state of nature, man is born free. But this state of primordiality, this pure sacral nature, is violated by human egotism and lust for power. This implies a brutal condition of struggle in which some have won power, while others have been enslaved. Those who hold this rough physical power translate it into justice and normative propriety. The subdued must obey. The Edenic landscape, once given to the first men, has been annihilated by the entry of brutal lust for power. Rousseau thus interprets the fall as only a terrestrial drama, a secular tragedy. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. What Rousseau understands as the innocent paradise of nature in reality involves the Judeo-Christian fall, because the liberty that the first humans believe they must win by disobeying the command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is, in Rousseau's paradise, the very foundation stone of human existence. And man's revolt against the dispositions of heaven, the attempt to be like God, the equal of God, is the second foundation stone in Rousseau's paradise. In his sacral order of nature, Rousseau erects his dream castle on two pseudo-archetypes, liberty and equality, and with these he builds the primordial foundations for what he preaches as terrestrial justice. Man now has his objective to overthrow what Rousseau regards as the artificial and unjust arrangement of things in which brutality and oppression dominate, and to bring creatures back to their paradisal origins, the order of nature herself. Overthrowing injustice has, as a corollary, the positive aim of building up a constitution, of giving the holy order of nature terrestrial legitimacy on the basis of the two archetypes, liberty and equality. But this demands a structure of rectitude, of natural right and justice, which in its turn demands manifestation. This discovery is the contrat social, the social contract. Rousseau embraces the ancient idea that there is an innate order of justice in creation, a natural virtue and goodness, and this idea is certainly not absent from Western theology. Even the Gentiles, says St. Paul, have the law, and this deeply rooted principle of justice pervades the Middle Ages. But with its secularization in the Baroque period, we are confronted with the notion of a profane natural right. The English social philosopher Thomas Hobbes shows the way with his treatise on sovereignty, and his compatriot John Locke advanced the cause further by introducing the double contract, first a common one, and then a contract of sovereignty elaborated on the basis of the first. These theoretical contracts, combined with utopian ideas and constructions, are efforts to introduce into ordinary, palpable life, into the practical world, institutions by which man can dominate and eliminate lawlessness and arbitrary oppression. First, Rousseau liberates the contract from its earthly, institutional, and political character. He elevates it to a mythic dignity, with the intention of abstracting it from its profane condition. For Rousseau, nature is more than simply psychophysical phenomena. She is holy. Liberty and equality likewise are holy and inalienable. Rousseau speaks of la sainteté du contrat. All human beings are born equal, and thus one must rule out a social contract that includes sovereignty. The logical consequence is that everyone makes a contract with everyone else. By this contract, everyone unites with everyone else, and each gives himself up to the other, and in turn no one submits himself to anything or to any particular individual. Thus, power, oppression, and slavery are excluded, and thus, if anyone should possess a right not also given to others, a tyranny would result and the social contract would be broken. Rousseau apparently means that there is a kind of secrecy in this contract. Everyone gains only the right that he has yielded to everyone else, and what is given is returned in reciprocity, or, as Rousseau puts it, mutuality. This mutuality engenders a state of both liberty and equality. Man is free in the sense that he is his own ruler, making his own laws. At the same time, in his mutualism, he lives in equality, an equality that has a judicial prolongation, namely citizenship. We cannot deny differences in power and intelligence, but this is nature's own injustice, which, Rousseau declares, finds compensation in the fact that everyone feels himself equal under the contract and in his citizenship. The development of this social contract requires Rousseau to proceed further down the road of pseudo-myth. Everyone will now have an associate status in the moral corporation, and not merely in a collectivity. The liberty of the individual is unchanged, but the contractual act excludes every form of social atomism and chaos, because the social contract, as a moral corporation, is a unity. The contract-making multitude ascends to a higher ego. By this ascent, Rousseau adds another important element to the structure of his myth. Man's new power on this earth demands that his individuality, his ego, be united with a collectivity that legitimizes his boundless earthly power. The individual and the collectivity must constitute a common identity. Man and mankind will be one. Rousseau has now resolved two fundamental constitutional problems. With the social contract, he fills the vacuum we encounter when the traditional order is denied and abandoned, and he bridges the insupportable schism between the individual and the universal. The social contract is therefore much more than a judicial and moral act. The contract brings man, and therefore mankind, out of social bondage. Man is elevated above all norms, above time and space, above all historical change and processes. The social contract thus has the elemental hallmarks of myth, because it is, in its primordial origin, absolute. Man is divinized. He has usurped the place of God. The corporation, this higher ego that we now confront, manifests itself in the most varied forms, corresponding to the needs of the community. When this ego has to be an official personage,
it is called the republic or the political corporation. When passive, it is called the state or the city, and when in an active relationship, it is called sovereign. Its collective and associative form is called the people, while in its individuality it is called the citizen, and when considered under the law, it is called the subject. Rousseau uses the word nature in two senses: the original, just order of nature, and the situation in which life is dominated by struggle, greed, oppression, and slavery. He makes a very important distinction here. Private life is not to be eliminated. Indeed, it cannot be, for it pertains to human nature in its individual manifestation. But it is society, the human collectivity, where private interests and the desire for power dominate, which must be overcome by the social contract, and thereby man will be restored to his primordial purity and innocence. It is thus that Rousseau speaks of the sanctity of the social contract. But how is all this to be realized? Precisely here Rousseau faces a fundamental problem: dominion. In Rousseau's scheme of things, dominion and oppression are inseparable. Dominion always means hierarchy, verticality, and here we are led to one of the summits of Rousseau's pseudo-mythical landscape. Dominion itself is to be abolished. The social contract accomplishes this stroke of magic. The contract is by its nature egalitarian, and in virtue of this necessity, no one can be oppressed. Equality is the great peacemaker. But what is to be done with the manifestations of the corporation that, in collective form, we call the people, which in individual form we call the citizen, and which is now presented as the state, now as sovereign or sovereignty? These ideas and institutions must be explained. They cannot be left to appear simply as political sphinxes. The state, the sovereign, the people, the citizen must be manifested and realized as a living corporation, and Rousseau bestows on it a life. He gives it a will, a higher will, la volonté générale. The social contract now becomes a living organism, having its own will, and this will is sacrosanct, expressing what the sovereign people really intend. At the same time, it thereby expresses the common good. In a perversion of vox populi, vox Dei, the people's will is exchanged for the divine will. The sovereign people is not an enigmatic political sphinx. It is a living higher ego, and its will realizes the terrestrial order, replacing the egotistic system of oppression with the primordially righteous state, thus expressing the inner meaning of nature. This higher will must be realized in practice, however. It must enter the world in manifested form. The sovereign citizens have to meet and determine from a multitude of private meetings what must develop into the volonté générale. Rousseau never denies that private interests exist. On the contrary, he says expressly that if private interests were not real, the social contract would be superfluous. No, here we have a metamorphosis wherein human choices are elevated from the merely private to the general will, where the popular will is to be realized. And how? Rousseau does not have a sanctum officium, a papal holy office, nor a Stalinistic politburo at his disposal, nor has he any authority founded on canonical scriptures. But he tries to find and explain different ways in which the ascension can be accomplished. By deliberation, he says, it may be possible to bring a multitude of different opinions into concert. The more thoroughly we discuss a question, the more our differences can be reduced, and by this means we can come nearer to what we want to achieve, namely, unanimity, and unanimity expresses the popular will. As men's interests are purely private, according to Rousseau, can there be any guarantee that merely exchanging ideas and opinions will accomplish liberation of the ego from those interests? Seeking a way out of this dilemma, Rousseau tries to find support in his idea of mutuality, which already exists in the primordial social contract. When popular decisions are forthcoming, private interests will be treated as pluses and minuses. What happens then? These pluses and minuses can cancel one another. The result of this politico-mathematical process will be the volonté générale, the general will. Rousseau is a master at manipulation, and he evidently means that we must find two ways out of all dilemmas and contradictions. His problem is to explain this miracle that lifts man out of his egotism and realizes his higher status as citizen. One of these paths is the politico-arithmetic pluses and minuses preceded by penetrating discussions. The second is moral and psychological. The social contract has two cornerstones, the two archetypes of liberty and equality, and these exclude every form of oppression. A kind of harmony between the private and the general, between the individual and the official, thus arises from the social contract, and he declares a wonderful coincidence of interests and justice. In all of his prodigious myth-building, it seems that when he must explain this metamorphosis from the private to the general, Rousseau waves the banner of popular will, definitely abolishing all antinomies that human, individual, and social life contain. But in all of his manipulations, he cannot avoid confronting the vote. Men must vote, and thereby we have majorities and minorities. What now becomes of his whole system of myth? It seems as though Rousseau loses his footing here. Instantly, what is called the highest justice is seen to be naked power. Power has returned. He who is of the minority is told by the majority that he has not rightly understood the real content of the popular will. The Stalinist Politburo is prefigured. In Rousseau's one-dimensional world of popular sovereignty, there exists only a single will, a single truth, a single justice, and woe betide when you do not yield to it. Part 4. The proclamation that there is a new sovereign on earth, man, free and equal, man who maintains the volonté générale, receives its perfect expression in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's doctrine of social contract. No more do we have to make do with tales, dreams, utopias. No, this perfected expression means that the proclamation of Almighty Man is a myth rooted in the origin of existence itself, in nature. The power proclaimed by the myth rests, therefore, on the foundation of liberty and equality, the two archetypes of nature herself. It is in the great French Revolution of 1789, the historical climax of a long process of secularization, that the proclamation of sovereign man is made. Now myth must face up to reality, but the revolutionary reality is not the Jacobin Club alone. No, it is in a polyvalent world that Rousseau's myth must be realized. The new dominant class, the third estate, is that of sensual man, man with all his selfish interests, and, not least, man with his economic interests is now making his entrance. Guided by objects of desire, this kind of man is more and more inclined to live in a multiversum, and growing economic liberty offers richer and richer possibilities for following the objects of desire, his personal lusts. We must note that a great distance separates the new dominant class from that dreamer Rousseau, the man who proclaimed that money leads to slavery, the man who said, "Le mot de finance est une mot d'esclave." The result is a foregone conclusion. The history of the Jacobin Club is short. The club's encounter with reality is not a romantic tableau of ancient Greek life, where citizens of high political virtue and moral purity met in the agora. On the contrary, the third estate allows increasingly more scope for material interests. This new class, therefore, denies Rousseau's absurd and inherently contradictory system of Spartan discipline, the perverse absorption of all private and all sensual activity by public life, following the expression of Malthus. Does this mean that the glorious dream of sovereignty, equal man, and his universal will is crushed? No, not at all. The world that is now developing, especially after the Napoleonic Wars, involves profound mental and social changes. In short, one can characterize it as liberalism, commercial development, improved communications, land reform, scientific and technological, i.e. industrial progress. All of these factors lead men to believe in human progress. This new creed is given visionary form in the positivism of Auguste Comte. A new liberty has come into the world, and we must enjoy it to the full. There is no volonté générale to rein in the free play of human forces. As Max Weber says, we now lay the foundations of modern society. We distinguish the private from the public. Can we now say that Rousseau's magnificent edifice lies in ruins? Not at all. Liberty and equality, the two archetypes, live on with undiminished power. And the popular will more and more expresses the real power in the affairs of this earth. It is a question of new forms being moulded for the expression of these archetypes. Rousseau provides building materials for the new world of ideas from which the 19th century is being formed, the ideologies. It is very important here to distinguish between myth and ideology. Myth is an intelligible structure, an arrangement independent of the will and striving of the individual. Myth is based on a primordial paradisal state. It is transcendent, standing before man, as it were, elevated over every form of earthly appetitive life. Above all imperfections and oppositions, myth is absolute and does not admit of contradictions. It is total, universal, unlimited, high above time and space. It is non-historical in origin. Philosophically, myth reposes in pure existence. It is a commanding ontological power before which man has no choice but to obey. Ideology, on the contrary, is a frankly worldly system, and the material with which it is built belongs to the order of created things. Ideologies participate in the permutation of existence. They are integrally involved in time and space, taking part in the struggles and contradictions of the world. Indeed, ideology is itself a part of these contradictions, even if its goal is to bring all antinomies into a harmonious unity. The myth is that which is, but the significance of an ideology is determined by historical and existential becoming. In this new world that is opening up under the impulsions and potentialities of liberty, liberalism becomes the natural ideological form of expression. Bourgeois liberalism is propelled by rational and sensual individualism, rationally scheming, free to realize itself hedonistically, and it is controlled by self-interest. In this coherence of the rational and the passionate is formed the ideology that we call Western liberalism, which manifests itself as an attitude, as a philosophy, as a doctrine of social life, and as economic doctrine. Liberalism is first of all a manifestation of liberty. Now, liberty is not only freedom of choice, it is also liberty in an absolute sense. This means that it has its roots in a higher order. It is a property of humanity itself, deciding man's manner of thinking and acting. Liberty possesses an intrinsic value. De Tocqueville has this in mind when he says, "He who seeks something else in liberty than liberty itself is doomed to slavery." In Rousseau's myth system, liberty is one and indivisible, simultaneously individual and universal. It is elevated high above all earthly limitations. The liberty that we encounter in what we call ideological liberalism, on the contrary, is earthly. It belongs to the sensory order, the created world, and therefore it can be given a social, national, collective, or individual content and meaning. But before all else, liberty is the property of every individual, and as such it is the fundamental element in the idea of human identity. In the ideological doctrine that we call liberalism, human identity is founded exclusively on the individual. Liberalism thus rests on an atomistic conception of the human being. But the atomistic individual, entering the multiversum, does not bring the world to chaos. The liberal man, declaring himself a self-governing entity, is the dynamic wellspring of power in the modern world, continuously calculating and rationally adapting and exploiting a ceaselessly growing mass of experience. In a world of sensualism, he is always choosing the pleasant, towards which man is inherently inclined, and he likes to believe that his choices are always directed toward what is best in the long term. The liberal man is also a citizen, and in his social life and activity he cannot avoid the question, what is true and what is false? As John Stuart Mill says, truth is an endless number of fragments in which true and false are mingled. But the golden grains of truth can be sifted out, and this is accomplished by the unending, reiterated exchange of opinions. The lifeblood of liberalism, therefore, is debate and discussion. Every restraint, every limit on opinion must be denied. For only what every human individual perceives sensually and rationally, through the use of his sense faculties, only this constitutes his self-realization, and only this is right and valid. If debate is checked or stopped, this truth withers away. Thus, for the Spanish diplomat Juan Donoso Cortes, the liberal bourgeois class is a discussing class. In this continual exchange of opinions among free individuals, liberalism says, citizenship is formed, and the loftiest form of this exchange is institutionalized in parliamentary bodies, the representative community. The aim of citizenship is first of all to defend liberty and property, spiritual as well as material. For the concept of property, the word being conceived in its widest possible sense, belongs to the individual who in himself is his own identity. Property and the individual are one. Property, therefore, has not only a judicial but also a moral meaning. Life in the world of liberalism is a private concern before all else. In the same way that we win the truth and thereby provide ourselves a foundation of rational life, so must we shape economic life. The free exchange of goods, freedom of communication by road, by sea, all of this will involve the entire world in the exchange of goods, just as there will be a perpetual exchange on the so-called intellectual level, what John Stuart Mill calls the constant clash of opinions, where, it is postulated, truth always wins out over error. So in the same way, economic freedom will bring us the best and most useful goods. Liberalism is founded on certain distinct postulates that, nevertheless, are seldom discussed and even less frequently are critically examined. Often, not even the so-called intellectuals are aware of them. I mention three of these fundamental assumptions. First, every human individual is regarded as an inexhaustible well of energy, an active being dominated by mundane interests and by a ascendancy of the rational element in human nature, always directing his energy towards sane and lucid goals. But is there not a danger that subconscious and involuntary forces in humanity may gain an upper hand, and that man will become passive and succumb to the domination of pleasure and mere ingestion, to consumerism? Alexis de Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill discussed this possibility in an interesting correspondence. A possible resolution of their debate might be that liberalism continually offers new objectives for different kinds of human activity and for diverse sensory enjoyment. In short, there is an incessant change. Liberal man avoids mere passivity because life in the liberal scheme of things constantly offers a new avenue of activity and new opportunities for sensory experience.
The second hidden postulate is that the free play of diverse forces always produces a state of harmony and equilibrium. The generous production of goods and their free exchange results in stable prices that, in turn, issue into the market equilibrium of supply and demand. In these conditions, the pursuit of private gain by innumerable individuals does not result in chaos, but rather in social mobility and a desirable circulation of classes and goods, and to social harmony as well. For the needs of each individual are supplied by another individual's pressing desire for gain, and so the theory has it. This is similar for the innumerable transactions that make up liberal social life. Liberal man, with his rational calculations, his empirical trial and error, with greed as his lodestar, thus produces, despite himself, one might say, a harmony between merely private and public interests, between personal and collective life. In the end, liberalism means cosmopolitanism, free exchange between peoples and nations, not only of material goods, but also of spiritual values. It is alleged, therefore, liberalism presents itself as a doctrine of peace among men.
The third postulate is the doctrine of the positivity of truth. The liberal mind does not believe in a knowledge that is superior or anterior to reason. Intelligence, too, is atomistic. We must therefore arrive at our understanding of truth and justice by means of our own intellectual, that is to say, rational efforts. Man tries to find truth because he accepts the notion that if one finds the truth, one acts on it, a Socratic notion that modern liberalism has misunderstood. Continual searching and researching, gathering raw data, empirical trials, analysis through logical and discursive processes of thinking, always in a cadre of continuous debate. These are the operative demands of the liberal search for truth. Truth which, it is believed, is like grains of gold, washed and sifted in a free selective process, the false dross being separated from the noble metal of truth. Liberalism is thus the purest form of positivism. It will sustain a world of freedom in which truth will win out over the lie. The human spirit, says liberalism, finds itself only when in full freedom it searches for truth and justice. In the same way, the best goods are produced and brought to market. This positivist view is linked, partially at least, with two notable ideas, that of unending development, that is to say, uninterrupted progress, and the notion that what is regarded as truth participates in this progress. The true will become better and better, ever more true. Liberalism encounters the new Europe, a Europe that is more and more open to the free play of economic forces. But in the 19th century, liberalism is set amid a residual order of political, social, cultural, and spiritual hierarchies. Over against liberal republicanism stand the feudal and monarchical remains from the traditional order, forces that seek restoration. Liberalism must try to win over these forces. But this is not all. The new productive processes of Western industrialization entail urbanization. This marks the origin of a new social class, the proletariat, and this situation in turn brings liberalism into a new conflict situation. Part 5. First, industrialism means the division of the production process into segments. Second, it means the mechanization of these processes. In traditional pre-industrial production, tools are made to complement the human hand and arm. Extensions of human faculties, they are made in the measure of men, who is in no way diminished by their use. In production by the artisan, the processes are synthetic. The artisan begins with his concept of the whole, and on this basis synthesizes the materials and components that enter into the whole, making them into a final product, a unity. The sources of energy are mostly human, or at least subordinated to human faculties. The operation, however, is not humanistic. Though intelligence of the artisan dominates the operations involved, selecting and preparing materials, directing the tools, he is himself guided by intelligence of a higher order, ars sine scientia nihil. And we must note in particular that the artisan determines the rhythm and pace of the productive processes, which, like the tools, are made to the measure of man. The mechanization of industrial processes means that the source of energy, and a fortiori the presiding idea, are outside of and apart from the artisan. It means that machines and no longer man determines both the order of production and its final result. The human contribution will be atomized into numerous incomplete operations, most of them deprived of any qualitative element. Man may not become entirely passive in productive work, but he is nevertheless degraded. In a mechanized world, man becomes the servant of the machine. Traditional labor is a qualitative labor. It creates a product that integrally bears the imaginative, creative stamp of the craftsman. Traditional labor thus has an aesthetic content as well, for no one in his right mind strives to bring forth ugliness. At the same time, it has a moral or ethical content in the sense that an ever-present aim is to produce something worthy, for bad workmanship and carelessness always evoke contempt and condemnation. Traditional labor can be and is linked to the transcendent. Human labor can be a celebration of the Creator, for it can be regarded as a mimesis, doubtless with all its earthly deficiency, of the work of the Creator. In traditional labor, we encounter true joy in work, and most often, and not by accident, we hear the rhythmic songs occasioned by this joy. Mechanized labor annihilates these values. We find in their stead all the dominating considerations of economic value, implying a manner of life that is profanely conceived, a life lived by bread alone, a life that receives its benediction in political economy. Mechanized labor has as its most elementary sign the rotating wheel. Now the center of the wheel is the hub, which allows the wheel to rotate, and in this rotation the periphery is the essential for modern industrial processes. The more rapid the peripheral movement, the greater the material production, and vice versa. The mechanization of labor is not only a degradation of man, much worse than that, it is a tragedy. But the inhabitants of the city of man must conceal and atone for this tragedy. They will do this in two ways. The first is an effort to avoid plain, rough and heavy physical work. Machines will replace old-fashioned drudgery, and their greater productive capacity will multiply profit and contribute to higher living standards. Second, they will increase so-called leisure time, bringing man pleasure and happiness, not to speak of the humanist illusion that an increase of leisure brings with it cultural amelioration. More and more energy will be freed from fatiguing labor. When the plough advances by itself through the field and the shuttle through the warp, then man will be truly free, according to Aristotle. The mechanization of human work, with the purely economic ends that are implied, entails a fundamental alteration in social interchange, namely the loss of patriarchalism. Traditional working life involved patrons and masters who had the obligation of the patriarchal function, including that of custody for their workers. However insufficiently and uncharitably these may have been carried out, the capitalist, whether state, private or mixed, industrial system annihilates all of this. Patriarchal bonds are broken. In a world dominated by machines, by the owners of capital, and by the struggle for profit, the morale of the proletariat is marked by a sense of abandonment. Not only has the worker been disenfranchised as a producer through the mechanization of productive life, he has also been atomized socially. He is the bastardized slave of the machine, and here we see the fate
of the modern industrial proletariat that Karl Marx describes with the Hegelian terms Entfremdung and Entauserung, respectively alienation or estrangement and renunciation, relinquishment or termination of property rights. In the bosom of bourgeois liberal society, a new social class comes into existence, and in this very fact the Third Estate's liberalism faces a new negation. Liberalism, individualism, and atomism are no solution for this new class, and therefore the people demand a new system of belief. Socialism is born in a surge of ideology. Socialism in general and Marxism in particular draw radical conclusions from the two great changes, the loss of fatherhood and the mechanization of labor, that industrialism brings in its wake. The worker has been deprived of his tools and is estranged from the new giant apparatuses of production, and it is at this point that Marx introduces his Hegelian Entfremdung, estrangement or alienation. Further, the capitalist, the owner of the productive apparatus, imperatively needs the worker. He, the worker, must in turn sell not only his productive power, but also his human dignity as producer. Here Marx introduces the Hegelian Entauserung, the relinquishment or alienation of property. As for the problems of ownership, a return to a pre-industrial status is impossible because the capitalist industrial system requires both private ownership and a collective form of production. Thus, a reconciliation between labor and capital must itself be collective. Therefore, say the socialists, the answer lies in a productive community, a fellowship of the productive apparatus. Marx declares that by this socialization man will become free, delivered from the damning Entfremdung and Entauserung. According to Marx, man is not only tied to productive forces, he is by origin a universal being united with this world. With mankind, he is, as Marx says, following his mentor Hegel, a Gattungswesen, a collective being, a collective personality, living in a kind of mystical unity with the world itself. In this way, then, man is tied to his own life as a worker, and consequently is united with his tools. To the question, what is man? Marx answers, man is a producer. Is this the way that Marx proposes to solve the problem of man's atomization and alienation in industrial society? In a fantasy of simplistic Hegelian dialectic, capitalism explodes. Socialism will show us the road to the original, primordial, and just order of production, the elimination of the capitalist system, the last antagonistic form of the productive process in society. Marxism holds that by this institutional revolution, the unfailing road to human liberation and human happiness will open before us. The second great challenge, the loss of patriarchalism, means for Marx a liberation from every kind of hierarchy. All that is vertical and transcendent in human existence will be replaced by horizontality of brotherhood. We must freely associate labor with its community of property, with distribution according to the principle that everyone must produce what he is able to make and that everyone will receive according to his needs. All of this is to be accomplished in an order of brotherly solidarity in which, simultaneously, the individual achieves, in Hegelian terms, self-realization. Just as with liberalism, socialism proclaims that reality is one-dimensional. There is no power commanding human life higher than man himself. Liberty, equality, and fraternity are the lodestars for both of these 19th century ideologies. Both have inherited from Rousseau the notion of human sovereignty, and, for both, liberty and equality are original, pre-rational, primordial pseudo-archetypes. The free and the equal are regarded as fundamental ingredients in the historical process. But there are essential differences between liberalism and socialism. For the liberal, freedom and equality are potentialities, starting points for individual as well as social life.
For the socialist, freedom and equality are final goals because only when socialist transformation is realized, when alienation is eliminated, can man be free. The liberal thinks in terms of the individual, atomistically. The socialist thinks in terms of the collectivity. The liberal thinks positively. The socialist thinks dialectically. These differences are important when we consider the notion of citizenship. The liberal citizen is an individual, the dynamic well of energy in the social order, and the corresponding civic aims are to defend life and liberty and the property of the individual. The communal civic effort, therefore, will be the sustained endeavour to defend and conserve these values, first of all by parliamentary debates. Liberal citizenship is political. For the socialist, citizenship is won first of all by eliminating the conflicts and antagonisms of society, by placing production, the word is used here in its widest possible sense, in the hands of the whole people. The liberal lives individualistically in the world that surrounds him. Socialist citizenship is integral when it is achieved. Man and labour, man and nature, man and society all enter into a dialectical unity, into a cosmic solidarity. It is in this cosmic solidarity that man, in the socialist meaning, enters society as a citizen, a trustee, integrally and actively taking part in all fields of existence. The Marxist regards politics, conceived in its liberal meaning, with its public institutions and its debating parliaments, as a centralized system of coercion that will disappear when integral governing citizenship is realized. Then, as Friedrich Engels says, der Staat stirbt ab. The state passes away. These two dominant 19th century ideologies, liberalism and socialism, are impressive in their vitality. Though both are varied and manifold, both also constitute a negation of all that remains of the old traditional order. They are ecclesiae militant, church militants, and therefore are often found in intimate collaboration against tradition, their common enemy, but at the same time they are deeply and reciprocally in conflict. Both are founded on sturdy cornerstones. One of these is man, a strong indivisible unity, a centre of energy and consciousness, dominated by his individual interests, and with his indomitable will striving for self-realization. In liberalism, an individual goal, but in socialism, a collective one. The second cornerstone, society, is in fact an extension of the first. In liberalism, society is the locus of human activity and is where every form of progress is realized. In socialism, sensate man's aim is to find his dialectic unification with and in a non-contradictory cosmos. Secularization progresses through the 19th century amid all the smoke from ideological flames, and this growing worldliness is reflected in the ever-recurring compromises of theology. In its strategic and tactical retreats, man is regarded as essentially a corporeal and mental entity, monadic and invariable. It is presumed that he always has a stable ground underfoot in permanent social circumstances. All of these assumptions, this hubris, contribute to belief in a general, undeviating progress. No failures, no deceptions, no doubts can win man away from his cherished belief. Go forward, humanity, be happy, be solaced, for you carry eternity in your bosom, sings the Swedish poet Viktor Rydberg. Part 6. Symbolically speaking, traditional man lives between heaven and earth. Certainly he is conditioned by his terrestrial bonds, but simultaneously he lives under a higher divine dispensation. He can conform to and obey these providential arrangements because he himself participates in a luminous secret immortality that conveys to him his consciousness and knowledge that his sensory and mental faculties cannot provide in and of themselves. Man consists of body, soul, and spirit, the Greek soma, psyche, and nous, the Latin corpus, anima, spiritus.
The spirit, nous, Meister Eckhart's intellectus, gives man his central value and dignity, raising him above the limitations of the merely sensory and psychic orders and giving to his intelligence the capacity of objectivity and the possibility of contemplating the divine. Thanks to these qualities, man can distinguish between the real and the unreal, between truth and untruth, between good and evil. When man affirmatively and effectively recognizes his higher destiny, he gains a new, sober, and nobler personal unity, a higher ego, a reflection of the self of esoterism. His sensual ego, his corporeal and mental capacities, are certainly not denied by this, for they are homologous elements in the integral human individual, but they are subordinated to the spiritual self. Reason, will, the life of the senses, and the imagination, all of these concur in and provide terrestrial confirmation of the self-consciousness giving spiritual light. This means that man has a higher knowledge, a spiritual insight that is intuitive in the sense of being supra-rational and not determined by logical, discursive, experiential criteria. Yet this higher knowledge is at the same time linked with our sensory, earthly capacities, all of which have an active role to fulfill in man's spiritual life. It is thus that we can say that man lives between heaven and earth. Secularization initially enters the life of mankind not so much by direct denial of the divine, but rather by making man himself co-equal with God. In paradise, the serpent does not ask man to deny God. He says only that man can be like God. In this effort to be the analogue of the divine, it is necessary to mobilize the earthly sensate forces in man's nature, and first of all, sensuality and reason, sensus and ratio. The triumphal march of secularization has many phases. The scientific and technological successes of the Baroque era were supposed to redound only to the heavenly power, ad majorem Dei gloriam. No philosophers or scientists aim to dethrone the King of Heaven. Not even the most far-reaching political revolutions before 1917 dare to exclude the celebration of the Almighty, and the various ideologies gain much power by making into themselves paradisal notions and dreams. But the road to secularization leads implacably to a premeditated devolution of energies, which are then deployed on the sensate level. One of the fundamental postulates in this triumphal progress is that, corporeally and mentally, man is a fixed and indivisible unity. Is man, in fact, anything besides a sum of physical and psychic forces? This reductive question is already posed in the French Revolution of 1789, and is an ill-omened query. Again, man is conceived as dynamic but fixed, a centrum of energies. To this is added a conception of society that is assumed to be similarly unchanging. Traditional society was a human community on all levels, and even in all of its mundane complexity, traditional society was not a chaos because it was ruled by a higher divine order. Traditional society was molded in cultic forms, a cult that expresses the truth that man had to accept and to obey the heavenly norms or suffer the consequences. The social hierarchy also reflected this order. It was equipped with the power of command and enforcement and required obedience. Earthly and social power was a reflection of the divine order. Traditional society was therefore an interplay between vertical and horizontal forces. This idea was not altogether absent even as late as the 20th century, even if it was more and more called into question. A living society must, on the one hand, have a harmonious interplay between freedom and equality, and on the other, it must have the hierarchical principles of value and order. There must be a harmony between self-interested and unselfish citizenry, between independence and obedience. 3 fundamentals are to be found in a traditional society. First, a spiritual cultic community combined
with a constant moral consciousness. Second, social solidarity extending beyond all particular interest groups and organizations. And third, an ethnic and historical affiliation, wherein memories serve to unite men in a common inheritance and readiness to sacrifice. Secularism postulates that man is a fixed, indivisible, and dynamic center of forces. To this is added the belief that society represents an inalienable and stationary order. The optimism and belief in progress of the 19th century found support in these postulates. Millions were attracted to contemporary ideologies. Romanticism, humanism, and countless idealistic movements, so-called, all gave generations hope for betterment, peace, and freedom. We must be aware of how these movements, in their marvelous vitality, profoundly influenced and changed the whole 19th century. Powerful and, as it seemed at the time, victorious ideologies lit incense, so to speak, and wrapped themselves in fragrant smoke, concealing motives of egoism and pleasure-seeking that they really sought to advance. These climates of opinion impressed on society their daydreams, proclaiming themselves the bearers of citizenship that in reality they undermined by secret egoism and competing selfish interests, all the while weakening the forces of unselfishness, which are the only real basis for citizenship. Now, as we reach the close of the 20th century, it becomes increasingly more apparent that these ideologies, bearers of generations of enthusiasm and vitality, are losing their strength. The two received fundamentals and the two seemingly inexhaustible sources of power, namely the human individual and an unshakable social order, begin to waver in the mindsets and aims that sustain them. More and more, the magnificent romantic view of man is replaced by the ambitions of individuals and of groups, focused on very narrow interests. Society, this societas humana, is menaced by accelerating economic and technological developments and, in the political and social order, by proliferating bureaucracy. Within this world of bureaucracy, a modern leviathan is rising, the all-competent state. Society is a living organism and probably should be the carrier of a hierarchy of values, of unshakable spiritual and moral norms. Society is of the qualitative order. But this commonwealth is now threatened with replacement by a centralized world of bureaucracy whose aim is to dominate the vacuum that a withering civilization is leaving behind. The modern industrial and social state is quantitative in nature and, as centralized bureaucracy, it has no moral norms. The aim of the modern state is to intervene continuously and to regulate the secular order wherein sensate interests are increasingly dominant. Once upon a time, in traditional societies, laws were complements and confirmations of an order of things that had its profoundest roots in the spiritual realm and in a social morality deriving from that realm. Now we see the opposite. A feverish, administering, regulating, legislating activity becomes unavoidable, and the power of the state necessarily grows apace. Economic and productive life also calls forth administrative and bureaucratic pyramids. The scope for responsible citizenship is steadily eroded. Man will become more and more a subject. It is an irony of destiny that new scientific theories relating to the world of particle physics have had a deep effect on the 20th century thought at the same time that the venerable conception of the natural order, valid for centuries, is no longer fully in force. The new foundation stone of existence, the atom, is no longer what it once was. The new physical tableau of the world, linked with such names as Max Planck, Albert Einstein, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and many others, offers a conception of physical reality that,
according to Heisenberg, is more akin to that advanced by Heraclitus more than 2,500 years ago. Quote, "You cannot step twice into the same waters, for other waters are ever flowing in," end quote. For modern physical theory, at least, this means that creation is reduced to a level even lower than its constituent sensory elements. Nothing can be said to be anything else, ultimately, than an atomistic multiversum. Consequently, man is conceived as a being lacking any primary substance. He's nothing other than an inner flux, whose mental and corporeal faculties are mere functional details. In the middle of the 20th century, this novel and doubtless volatile view receives a comprehensive mathematical and technological interpretation: cybernetics. Its leading exponent, Norbert Wiener, 1874 to 1964, offers us a view of existence as a riverine landscape. The principal reality is chance, but there are islands where, with our scientific and technical activity, we can take up residence. Man's primary task in this universal and accidental flux is to find ways and means for information, communication, and control. He has machines at his disposal, he has organizing talents, and organization is necessary for man as well as for society. Life, therefore, is a struggle for order, and order is necessary for survival. And at present, survival means the maximum exploitation of technology. Humanistic ideas such as life and soul lose their meaning because both are reduced to the nervous system, which operates according to the same principles as do binary electronic machines, both being merely apparatuses. The alternatives these machines choose are selected on the basis of prior performance. From the viewpoint of the binary mathematical machine, the individuality of the soul consists in persisting memories and instructions, and the mental processes develop along previously evolved courses. According to Wiener, to live means to be receptive to a continuous stream of influences from the environment, to the stimuli of the milieu. Thus we are only elements in a process. To live is to participate in all that is happening in the world, to take part in an uninterrupted development of knowledge, a knowledge that is never conclusive but is forever in process, forever becoming. We are elements of communication, media whose cogs and strata are human organisms. Thus it is of very little significance whether the fundamental material is human or mechanical. Such is the conclusion of Norbert Wiener. Consequently, principial differences between man and machine do not exist. A machine can be connected with another machine without human intervention, and by electronic or mechanical circuitry, a machine can exercise self-control. Wiener was a mathematician and physicist. Thinking along these lines led him to believe that fluidity and chance are major factors determining human life on this earth. We have to find our abodes on islands of entropy, he says, where we can live with our information, our communication, and our controls over the chaotic flux of existence. In this cybernetic life, according to Wiener, we live and act in essentially the same manner as do machines. Wiener can be regarded and dismissed as a cynic, but in reality he only provides, possibly in an extreme form, a mathematico-physical interpretation of modern man and his entire existential situation in the presumed universal flux, a flux that lacks any foundation whatsoever. What must be understood is that modern man, in his secularization, lives in a one-dimensional universe wherein his mental and corporeal energies and faculties are, as outlined above, only functional details. In this existential situation, the integral human individual is reduced to the sum of his functions, in effect condemned to an existence in which chance is the dominant feature. And in this accidental world, what can be said to be good, what bad? What Wiener describes in his cyberneticism is the Western predicament as revealed initially by modern science. Wiener describes this predicament mathematically, even while giving it a symbolic interpretation. This situation, however, demands a more ample explication, a total interpretation of existence that contemporary Western men will find valid. Such an interpretation not only must be founded on a scientific, quantitative point of view, it must also unify man and the world in which he lives. This pretentious aim requires us to rise above all particular branches of science and their specialized perspectives, on occasion that provides an entry for profane speculative philosophy. In this new task, philosophy must try to interpret man's world, and the interpretation must be both historical and pioneering. An adequate philosophical system must explain man and his condition. It must take into account and unify prior ideas, movements, and aspirations, showing where man comes from and where he is going. In other words, such a system must concurrently open doors to an enlarged consciousness of existence, a gestalt of reality, and it must prepare a consciousness that at the same time is linked to historical roots and can serve as a guiding star. The prevalent outlook of Western secularism is the result of a historical process, at least on the obvious level. It expresses the consciousness of modern man, in whose view existence is a reductionist nothing more, a Heraclitic unidimensional flux. For modern man, nothing is superior to current received opinion. It is this one-dimensional flux that will be dressed up in philosophical costume. We are, as it were, waiting for Godot, waiting for the philosopher of the city of man. Part 7. The German philosopher Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, provides the most ample philosophical statement of the new outlook. He is, for the 20th century, what Hegel was for the 19th, and what Kant was for the 18th. In his most important work, Sein und Zeit, 1927, published in 1962 in English translation as Being and Time, Heidegger represents reality as a one-dimensional existential flux. The starting point for his philosophy is the language, but not the reality, of ancient Greek ontology, the effort to explain being as the most general of all concepts. Being is the foundation of existence, that from which existence springs forth. Existence is for Heidegger's central concern. Being, the Aristotelian toon, cannot be defined. It is obscure, says Heidegger. When we ask what being is, we do not know what is means. There is nothing superior to being, which is itself horizontal and one-dimensional, and which therefore includes both heaven and hell, celestial and infernal states. As being includes all existence, our life, can be nothing more than one modality, Seinsmodi, among other modalities of existence, and these Seinsmodi, in Heidegger's expression, must be strictly separated from being itself. Being is the essence of life, of the existential, Wesensverfassung des Daseins, in Heidegger's words. But what he calls existence, Dasein, being there, what is it? Well, life is existence. But this kind of existence, when it exists, is found in consciousness only. And here we have a formulation typical of Heidegger. Does existence, Dasein, being there, have a meaning? Yes. Zeitlichkeit, the timely. We can understand what existence essentially means as being only when we grasp this timeliness, this Zeitlichkeit, even if we are incapable of grasping being itself as essence. We can nevertheless get an idea of being, immersed as it is in existence, from the experience of time. The phenomenon we call time is at the root of all of the knowledge we possess of the problems of existence. It is in time that we can distinguish the various sectors of our existence. We live in the current of time, which means that our existence is that which was. Existence, in other words, is the past. If we must speak of meaning in connection with being, we find it in temporality, Zeitlichkeit, in the current of history. There are no firm points in our existence. All is in flux. We step into a river, but even as we do so, it is no longer the same river. For as Heraclitus said, other waters are ever flowing on. Or in the words of Norbert Weiner, we are ourselves floating in an ocean of entropy. Where does man enter this picture, and how? According to Heidegger, it is by speech. The Greek word logos, word, implies not only verbal activity, speaking, it also has broader, more ambiguous and more profound senses, as both Plato and Aristotle attest. St. John, too, clearly indicates this in the prologue of his recension of the Gospel. Logos means intellect, idea, reason, discourse, definition, judgment. But Heidegger annihilates all of these profound meanings of the word. For him, the term is univocal, having only a single and simple meaning, the activity of talking. But this talking, Heidegger's Rede, is necessarily linked to what has been apprehended. Talking concerns what has been beheld. To talk is to communicate experience by the use of words. Talking means connection with another person, contact with someone else. But at the same time, the important thing, says Heidegger, is that talking is linked with something seen or experienced, and this is what he calls a synthesis. But the synthesis is not to be regarded as a physical or mental process, an inner observation and assimilation of something external. No, it is only that the seen, the experienced, is linked to something else. That which is experienced is linked to that which is articulated. What is happening here? Not the true correspondence between object and mind, between experience and speech, between what is experienced and what is said. No, what occurs is that existence, Dasein, will be brought forth from the hidden and the unknown. In short, Dasein, being there, will be discovered. This is of fundamental importance. By bringing something out into the daylight, so to speak, it is existentiated and thereby becomes true. The corollary is that what is not existentiated is false, in that it is concealed. In this way, Heidegger answers the question, what is truth? Truth, for Heidegger, is sensation, perception. The conclusion is that what we observe is what is true. Truth, in other words, is the world of phenomenon, the ever-shifting world of things. Knowledge of existence, an ontology of sorts, is possible only when it is conceived as phenomenology. Being is hidden behind the scenes, but phenomena are manifested and seen. They constitute the existence of the being, as Heidegger says. Being itself, that which is hidden, Heidegger calls transcendence, but we are not to understand this in the scholastic sense, nor as the Greeks conceived it. Rather, for Heidegger, being is ecstatic, by which he means that it is outside of the phenomenal order. We humans are therefore confined within a horizontality that perforce separates us from being itself, living as we do in the world of phenomena. Is this phenomenal world, this world of things, as conceived in our highest consciousness, the world of reality? No, says Heidegger. Higher than this reality is possible. If we are to understand phenomenology properly, we must regard it as possibility. What does this mean? When we speak of the world of phenomena, this world has a fundamental structure. To be in the world, in der Weltsein, which is a prioristic, not based on experience. The world is everlasting, and I live in this world, but this I cannot be regarded as individually limited substance, which means that what we call I cannot be separated from others, from one another. Indeed, as existence is but a great current of time, how could such separation be possible? In this existential flow, we encounter the possible, the human I,
takes part in this and is one with existence, Dasein, being there, because existence is an unbroken stream, and this implies that what we call I has unlimited possibilities. Existence is mine, and at the same time, it is the stream of possibilities. This position of man in existence makes it possible for him to choose. In this existential flow, there is only subjectivism. This is one of the fundamentals of Heidegger's philosophy. Objectivity cannot exist because it presupposes an existential equilibrium, and such an equilibrium in turn presupposes an interplay between verticality and horizontality, to speak macrocosmically. Or to express it microcosmically, it presumes an inner and an outer. But Heidegger's philosophy proclaims a one-dimensional existence and, consequently, total subjectivism in a continuous stream. This radical subjectivism annihilates all boundaries between the ego, the I, and existence at large. Existence itself. When we ask who a man is, says Heidegger, we might as well ask what existence is. Between man and existence, there is total community. In this subjective totality, the ego, the I, meets others, fellow beings. But in a world without lines of demarcation, I cannot differentiate or separate myself from those other fellow beings, because all of us exist in common with our world. When I talk with myself, it is really existence that speaks to me. What I conceive as the ego, in a spatial sense, is only an existential space. In the same way, my fellow beings are not at all to be regarded as personalities, as our associates, but rather as mere modalities of existence. Even when I am alone with no companions, I am always with the world, says Heidegger. I am in a state of contact, Mitsein, and when we speak of others, we do not think of certain concrete persons. Everyone is interchangeable with anyone whomsoever. Quote, the other, der andere, is a double of the self, end quote. This statement is a typical formulation of Heidegger's. As human individuals, we are thoroughly replaceable. This is a consequence of his anthropology. Heidegger further confirms this interchangeability in his terminology. If we ask who is who, this does not refer to myself, to another person, or even to the sum of all persons. No, who is a neuter, man, as in the German das Mann. But we are not to regard this human neuter as something general, something abstract or subjective. On the contrary, das Mann is a neuter expressing the average, Durchschnittlichkeit, of human existence as a unidimensionality. In this neutrality, it is totally impossible for a human individual to be distinguished or elevated in any sense, and here we have Heidegger's egalitarian gospel. Every priority is excluded. Heidegger deeply disdains psychology and psychic phenomena. Nevertheless, he himself introduces a mental or emotional phenomenon and gives it an important role in his philosophy, namely fear. What is this fear? We meet it as a phenomenon in the world, and it has nothing to do with a power that resides over creation, nor is it a fear connected with some evil that menaces us. No, says Heidegger, it is occasioned by existence meeting itself as a slumbering possibility, for only existence itself can fear and feel anguish before itself. But what is it in existence that evokes fear and anguish? Heidegger's answer is that this anguish contains something of the sense of not to be at home, nicht zu Hause sein, that is to say, a homelessness, a rootlessness. Heidegger is well aware of this vulnerability. He proclaims a philosophical system in which there are no safety nets. We can find no help outside of the world because our existence is exclusively an existence within the world, in der Weltsein. It is included implacably within the horizontality of the world, outside of which we find only what Heidegger calls transcendent being, which is by his definition inaccessible, lacking any verticality and any superior element that could provide equilibrium in the world. Existence is one-dimensional. The total subjectivity of man finds no objective point of support. It is therefore meaningless to try to find an explanation of the world, because our only option is to enter into existence. In a world so conceived, man is rootless and homeless, and Heidegger thus can add to his philosophy an extremely important psychic characteristic. The human condition involves anguish. Time, as existential flux, is by no means a mechanical process. On the contrary, existence is animated. Man enters a state of consciousness, and the first thing he experiences is a clamorous calling, ruf. But this calling does not come from man himself, nor is it planned or desired. Calling expresses existence. This clamorous cry arises out of existence and has no message, no content. It is wordless, but at the same time, when considered by man, it is a dallying and an invitation to action, inviting us to go forth, sich entwerfen, in extroversion, and to enter into all of the possibilities that the world offers. Man will be active, but when he understands the meaning of this calling, which has no meaning, we are, says Heidegger, conscious of anguish, and this, in more than a mere play on words, is the anguish of consciousness. We come to the horrible realization that anguish or dread is inherent in consciousness. Heidegger sets consciousness before us, as it were, and his notion of calling, Ruf, is the voice of consciousness, Stimme des Gewissens. Existence is speaking to itself, and thereby to us, about this consciousness. Reception of this calling means that we are deployed in consciousness, that we understand ourselves, and when, volitionally, we accept this understanding, we enter into existence and into the possibilities that existence offers. But there is a very important consideration. Nothing could be further from the truth than to suppose that this consciousness is a guide towards the good and toward the elimination of the bad. To imagine I am good is a Pharisaism, says Heidegger, because consciousness tells us merely that existence is calling itself, and to us. In consciousness we also encounter guilt, but we are not to regard guilt or consciousness as moral categories. Why not? Because guilt belongs to existence, it is a priori. Existence in debt to being, and therefore existence bears the burden of guilt. At this point, Heidegger introduces an upheaval of conventional ideas of morality and moral norms, or more precisely, he delivers existence from all moral substance. Conscience is nothing but the state of consciousness we gain when we listen to the existential Ruf, calling, and we become aware of guilt when we are conscious of existence and of its debt to its own essence, being. What is truth? Even before Pilate, Aristotle posed this question, and his answer was the correspondence between the idea and the object of the idea, between knower and known. After a lapse of 2,000 years, says Heidegger, we are still at the same point. His own answer is that truth is the discovery of existence itself. Man must discover what the world consists of, existence itself, and we say about existence, this too is existence itself, for existence exhibits itself thereby. What we say about all of this with words, with our speech, this then will be truth. This is so total subjectivism. Speaking, truth is not something presupposed, assumed, or implied, because we are ourselves in the truth. No distance exists between the ego and its object. Everything is a subjective unity. Truth is nothing that has to be proven or demonstrated, nor can it be refuted. Existence itself is not something that can be subject to proof. Truth can be seen and given names, but it is man who sees and who gives names, and it is man who sees and who gives names to truth, and he does this with words, by talking. This process of seeing and name-giving is what Heidegger calls truth. Speaking of eternal truths is nonsense, he says. This is only a remnant of Christian theological ideas, not yet radically expunged. The philosopher of the city of man has spoken. Part 8. Western secularization is at the threshold of its fulfillment, and Martin Heidegger provides the philosophical formulations for this decomposition. The world is one-dimensional, spatial, horizontal, endless. Outside of the sensory order are two pseudo-metaphysical notions, being, as conceived by Heidegger, and time. There are no higher powers, no higher values. To speak of such dualities as spirit and matter, good and evil, has no meaning. Such ideas as grace, charity, mercy, and forgiveness are mere nonsense. There is nothing immutable in Heidegger's worldview, and consequently there is no objectivity. The flow of time in which existence and hence man too are immersed can only be subjective, both conceptually and actually. Man himself must be regarded simply as a modality of this flat existence, and his consciousness is only what is afforded him by this existence. In this situation, the gestalt that is man, with durable and substantive character, formed by centuries and centuries of Western thinking and by the sensitivities derived from this thought, all this counts for nothing and is completely denied. Further, the great paradox of Heidegger's philosophy is this: the grand picture of Western man, strong, free, conscious of his role, prepared to place himself on the throne of power and lording it over all of this is now open to question. All ends in subjective dissolution, wherein man himself loses all of his natural contours, all points of reference. A consequence without parallel in modern thinking is this: Heidegger makes the very conclusions of the secular conception of existence into a sensory stream, while at the same time providing the forms of consciousness that correspond to this description of reality. Heidegger's philosophy does not bring chaos. No, it provides a consciousness of this chaos and interprets it, thereby endorsing it. Herein is the great menace for the Western world. Is it not necessary, or at least highly desirable, that the Christian world prepare for obligatory and unavoidable war in confronting existential philosophy? Not at all, and so it would seem, for we have seen only very weak and futile resistance mobilized by Christian theologians, custodians of the values of the West. In fact, most of Heidegger's ideas have been met with silence, and his philosophy is even regarded with positive interest and has been accepted and integrated into so-called existential theology. I'd like to interject here to remind my audience to think of Alexander Dugin, who professes to be a Christian and a perennialist, and yet says that Heidegger is the foundation stone of his political philosophy. Anyway, continuing with the text. In the modern West, theology has more and more taken on the character of pragmatism. Worldly and profane activity, social welfare, and profane ethical notions have increasingly thrust any lingering transcendence into the shadows. Objective, dogmatic systems of truth are replaced by subjective adventurism, not least on the level of social sentimentality. The spiritual loses its defining features, its contours obscured by a new emphasis on psychological speculations. From this point, it is but a short distance to the proclamations of the German theologian and existentialist Rudolf Bultmann. There is in man nothing that we can call a soul, nothing whereby man can find an exit from existence, nothing to justify the belief that man can throw himself into the arms of God, into eternity. Indeed, according to Bultmann, anyone who believes this will only throw himself into his own arms, nur sich selbst in die Arme lauft. The blasphemers no longer have to scoff, for the ideas of sin and guilt have lost their lawfulness and force, nor do we have any more pardon and consolation. Theological disarmament has made significant contributions to this crisis. Its manifestations cannot be denied. There is crisis and confusion in our sense of identity. The crisis of identity is twofold. First, it concerns the inner man, who can no longer experience himself as a substantial unity, as a proud and self-conscious center of power, that great secular promise. But second, the crisis concerns our outer life as well, the dissolution of any normative social order and community, which are gradually replaced by an institutionalism governed from above by technocrats. We live in manifest and continuing crisis. Man is no longer en route to citizenship, but rather is on the way to becoming a new kind of passive subject in helotism of the modern industrial and social state. With its technical perfection, and technical perfection logically means government from above, in the face of technocratic hierarchy, every ideological system must experience its powerlessness, the loss of the awareness of the ego, in the traditional understanding of the word, the loss of a living, vital society. These constitute a double loss, the loss both of normative order and of community, both of which are essential for the wholeness of human life. A subsequent further loss is that of stimulating ideals and goals. In this situation, the kernel of the crisis is a consciousness of emptiness. People yearn for a new content in their lives, something to fill the aching void. This is why the period between the two world wars, the 20s and the 30s, sees the rise of reactionary and repressive movements that are revolutionary but set before man a wanted opportunity to spend themselves in striving toward specific goals. These movements often win surprisingly large popular support. The regimes that result face outward toward what had been the Anglo-Puritanical hope of 1919. Quote, to make the world safe for democracy, end quote. These racist manifestations of force serve their purpose in the process of dissolution, but eventually the city of man must declare war against these fantastic regimes with their one-party plebiscite elections. The Allied victory of 1945 is definitive, and not only over the fascist armies. It is much more significant that the victory in World War II is also a victory over and extirpation of the last remnants of traditional order in the Western world. The great victorious powers have affirmed that the unidimensionality of man is universally valid, and that the manner of life of the victors is exclusively right. Older, traditional forms for humane social living in the West now belong to history, and as historical phenomena they must be regarded as lower stages in the great tide of general human and social progress. This represents an exceedingly important change in the understanding of history. In his one-dimensionality, man now stands as dominant on earth, and the city of man is the pseudo-metaphysical expression of this new order in the world. Existentially, this new order is without spatial or temporal boundaries. This is modernism. Finally, this new world order gives itself a political and doctrinal gestalt: democracy. In this Trinitarian gestalt, city of man, modernism, and democracy, changes are implied in two essential ideas. First, in space, there is no longer a genuine human or social identity. The New World Order is a flux that banishes every stable point of reference, such points being essential for the establishment of any effective identity. Second, in time, this New World Order is ahistorical or post-historical. In its pseudo-metaphysical gestalt, democracy is the city of man. In its existential gestalt, it is modernism. And democracy no longer has a historical role as a dynamic force negating traditionalism. It is the victory over the last antagonistic form of human social organization, to borrow an expression of Karl Marx. Democracy is now static, non-historical. It has no obligation in the name of development toward the future, nor does it any longer have any obligation toward the past. But there is more to all of this. Democracy now becomes myth. It is Rousseau who at last wins a victory. It is his myth of sovereign man, of the sovereign people, with its volonté générale, its general will, that expresses what power is on the earth. Its primordial myth, resting in nature's own bosom, is disclosed in two archetypes, liberty and equality. The myth must now confront the reality and try to realize what the Jacobins could not. In virtue of its pseudo-original mythical character, democracy has absolute validity in time and space. Every alternative is excluded. In its myth of origin, democracy claims to represent an unchangeable order, invariable before every historical event and process, because it has its origins in nature herself. This alleged supremacy of democracy first manifests itself when it gives a universal moral and judicial validity to the Nuremberg Tribunal. Part 9. Traditionally, absolute and unrestricted liberty is reserved only for him who is above the entire universe and who is unfettered by anything in the created order, namely, Almighty God. But liberty is manifested on the terrestrial plane as well. In the Platonic sense, liberty is an archetype, a divine principle. Consequently, earthly liberties are imperfect reflections of their celestial model and source. In the terrestrial order, the created is necessarily something incomplete, lacking all achievement, because it is bound to forms, limitations, and contradictions. Earthly liberties, therefore, though real in their own order, are inevitably conditional. They exist in the manner that freedom of movement exists within a labyrinth. But the democratic myth is one of absolute, total, and limitless liberty that believes it can marvelously change the world. The state of liberty, on the one hand, and of constraint and lack of freedom on the other, have both physical and psychological meanings. Our sense of living, that which we experience most inchoately and in a most primary sense, has self-assertion as a given, immanent force. For this reason, man has always been aware of liberty. We see liberty here in the aspect of contrast. It appears as the negation of power in all of its diverse forms, whether this power be other individuals, ethnic groups, or nations, or political, social, cultural, or ecclesiastical hierarchies. Liberty is an energy that always strives to deliver itself from structures and systems of order. In historical development, therefore, liberty is a force that relativizes, corrects, dissolves, and sometimes revolutionizes. A healthy society is one that is capable of correcting its faults and renewing itself, and in this the desire for liberty has a very important role. The progressive force of liberty are undoubtedly an important force in social life, but the apostles of absolute human liberty too easily forget two factors that are unavoidable limiting agents wherever liberty is concerned. First, profane existence is by no means immune from the menacing consequences of the audacious experiments undertaken in the desire for liberty. we often forget how fragile our social arrangements are, in fact, that we do not always have stable ground underfoot, and that the human individual is an everlasting well of energy. Belief in notions of unrestricted liberty have led liberal social movements into very ominous directions. The second limiting factor concerns our possibilities of choice. Man has great possibilities of liberty. He can choose. His choice may concern some sensory object, or it may concern a system of norms or ethical ideas among which his conscience may decide. But he always has freedom of choice. In all of this we experience great freedom. It is very tempting to think that liberty is something endless, something without bounds. We are wont to think that, at long last perhaps, we may be able to use liberty to escape the existential labyrinth. We forget that when we have made a choice, we are thereupon bound to the object of our choice. We live in a subject-object antinomy, and we cannot escape the antinomies of existence. Even freedom of will, freedom of choice, comes to an end, at least from the formal standpoint. We are bound to what we have freely chosen. If I may so express it, this is one of the paradoxes or absurdities of life. We cannot deny that the desire for liberty has a positive value, and we must recognize its positive role in history. Both in individual and in social life, the lack of human freedom would lead to stagnation and petrification. Life on earth is continuous change, a multiversum, and the element of human freedom is a necessary motive of action. In this sense, Norbert Wiener and Martin Heidegger are witnesses to truth. But unbridled liberty has another aspect. It dissolves all ideas of value. It relativizes and atomizes. In the life of secularized man, as well as in secularized society, strivings for liberty always open up new and growing sectors of pluralism and relativism at the expense of stability and continuity of values. Endless dialogue, debate, and scientific investigation fill the vacuum. Medieval Occamist nominalism dissolved the ideas and values formed and molded in Christian experience, transforming these into an atomism of thought and ideas under the seal of freedom of thought. Similarly, Western profane science cultivates a method of structural analysis that leads to excellent scientific achievements, but at the same time leads to atomization, separativity, and definitely not, be it noted, to what was the early dream of profane science, namely a great synthesis of the knowledge of existence. The inverting and revolutionary effects of liberty are evident especially in aesthetics. When the plastic arts, as well as poetry and music, become areas of aesthetic experimentation, the values of beauty as invariable states and forms of consciousness are more and more dissolved, so that in the end there is nothing left to revolutionize. The final result is that the aesthetic negates itself. Art exhibits itself as anti-art. Liberty, in its aspect of relativizing, atomizing force, one that dissolves all values, we speak still of liberty as an element in historical processes, leads to a state of pluralism that is then invoked as one of the noble, indispensable fruits of Western development and modern life. We see the advent of the heterodox and so-called tolerance. Heterodoxy not only strives towards moral and theological liberalization, but also toward emancipation from axiomatic truths inherent deep in nature herself, and notably human nature, from what is traditionally held to be the natural order. We cannot forget that every human being and every society has, and must have, taboos, instinctive prejudices, if you will,
that are necessary for its very existence. Western liberalism is a historical process that, linked with heterodoxy in the name of liberty, continuously attacks these forms of order. And this is one of the effective ways to disarm and destroy a society, take from it its very possibilities of self-defense.
The struggle against physical and mental oppression has often been a positive element in Western development. The shadow side of this, however, the other side of the coin, is the disastrous dissolution of values, even of the very idea of value, of normative systems, of the taboos and prejudices necessary to personal as well as to social life, a dissolution sanctioned by a misconceived liberty. And now, when liberty is proclaimed to have the status of a myth, and is thereby thrust forward with demands that it be absolute, total, and without limits, in this we see that the myth of liberty becomes anarchy. The virtual aspect of heterodoxy is so-called tolerance. In its Voltairean sense, tolerance is announced as the noble hallmark of Western freedom, and is contrasted with orthodox intransigence. But Voltaire, in his hatred of orthodoxy, has distorted the picture. The essential meaning of the word tolerance is forbearing and patient endurance. Historically, it means an appeal to magnanimity and even-handedness towards people of different opinions. Tolerance does not mean the surrender of truth nor of one's own positions, nor does it imply passivity or brotherly love when a valid system of values is reduced to ashes. Respect for one's fellow beings is immanent intolerance, and this implies recognition of one's own and one's fellow's imperfection as well as worth. From the historical perspective, tolerance is always subject to tests. It is something that is always wrestling with limits. Where, indeed, are the limits of tolerance, of patience? Tolerance loses its meaning when it is not linked with compassion, with caritas, which clearly implies not only self-knowledge, but also knowledge of human nature. When tolerance is reduced to the mere expression of general liberal denial of values, it is no longer, as it is claimed to be, an expression of humane sentiments and love for mankind. Having reached this point, tolerance has lost all meaning and is merely an expression of indifference. It is then only a short way to the demand for a war of extermination against the traditional, the qualitative, the orthodox, the venerable. Écraser l'infamé, said Voltaire. Liberty is one of the foundation stones of the democratic myth. In the historical process, liberty was a notion of contrast and a necessary element in the struggle against oppression and enslavement. Liberty is a necessary element in a vital society, an essential factor that brings equilibrium to earthly life. But in the democratic myth, as it has been proclaimed since the Second World War, liberty no longer has this mission. In the contemporary one-dimensional world, it is elevated into something that is principial, absolute, boundless, non-historical, and that requires no qualification. We are only too well aware that after the heady days of victory in 1945, harmony has not entered the world. Quite to the contrary, new controversies, new moral and mental problems have arisen. New phenomena of disequilibrium have been manifested. In politics and administration, in ethics and jurisprudence, order and the very idea of order are being denied and more thrust aside. Man and society in the Western world are in accelerating decay and face the gravest functional problems. Why? Liberty is now regarded as an archetypal totality and consequently has been made into something unlimited that cannot be reined in. The gates of dissolution and decomposition have been opened, and a low and blind pragmatism beckons. Everything that can be experienced is permitted, according to Gottfried Benn. When liberty continuously oversteps all boundaries, we must ask whether these trespasses can ever stop short of lies, of errors for error's sake, the most flagrant abuses. An answer comes from Jean d'Ormesson. If you deny liberty to those who are mistaken, then there is no more liberty, because to defend liberty is to defend its misuses. At last, high above all time and space, absolute liberty becomes a narcissistic ego manifestation, a way of behavior in which man, however weak he may be in his ego consciousness, can regard himself as in a mirror and see himself as the carrier of all physical and mental energies to which he thinks his total liberty entitles him. Part 10. The victors of 1945 have the task of preparing the way for the everlasting state whose enemies must be extirpated, even in a principial sense. The hierarchical, authoritarian forces, last remnants of the traditional order, must now be replaced by a one-dimensional democratic value system. In the name of tolerance and liberty, therefore, a surgical excision has to be performed, an excision that has its moral and judicial sanction from a universally valid triumph, before which the defeated enemy and his deeds, the war crimes, are to be condemned in the name of humanity. But is this enough? It is not enough that victory will result in an enduring state, nor is it enough to proclaim liberty as a narcissistic manifestation of the ego. The democratic myth has another foundation stone, necessary to guarantee this victory: equality. If democracy will make the coming Saturnalia durable, it must display itself as an order that is sacrosanct. Equality will render this possible. It is said that before the divine there are no differences between men, but this is true only in the sense that the Creator has given to every man an inner, immortal light. In this light, we are conscious of the divine reality. Quote, "In thy light shall we see light," end quote. Psalms 36:9, King James Version. And therefore we can have a creed and be confident that God will save us. The Creator has given us value and dignity, making us equal in his eye in this respect. But this equality is spiritual. In its terrestrial manifestation, it is qualitative, and thus essentially different from the ambitions of the city of man to establish an equality of a purely quantitative kind. History is full of fraternal battles, and we ceaselessly confront brutality and intolerance, the desire for power and the desire for revenge. Man represses and will be repressed. He persecutes and will be persecuted. When the repressed and the persecuted rise up in revolt, it is not necessarily and simply from base motives of revenge. In such cases, we can share with the revolutionaries a deep thirst for justice and dignity, and it is true that demands for equality are often made in such situations. Equality, like liberty, is an idea of contrast. The legitimate desire for equality reflects a need to re-establish a reasonable order while eliminating unreasonable and intolerable arrangements. In this sense, equality is, in the historical process, a positive ambition to restore a proper balance in the relations between human beings and societies. Equality is an effort to limit and, as far as possible, to eliminate the law of the jungle. And we can successfully pursue these aims by legislation and by the administration of justice. In the historical perspective, equality is the endeavor to achieve peace and harmony in earthly life. But in the utopian dream world, equality has a different function and position. When everyone is on the same level, when everyone receives exactly the same portion of what life has to offer, say the utopians, then peace and harmony will dominate and human fraternity will become a reality. Tales and dreams, utopias have been cultivated for millennia, but until recently they have always had a subordinate position as compared with social realities. It is only in our own time, when the great myth of democracy makes its entry and when equality is established as a pseudo-archetype, an essential element in this system, that fable and reality change positions. Equality is no longer merely a subordinate element in our mental and biological actuality. In the created and natural world, it is now heralded as an absolute and integral, an archetypal foundation stone in the city of man. Consequently, with the modern demand for equality, all that is hierarchical in the natural order of creation is in principle denied. It is probably impossible to say definitively to what extent interference in the basic biological structures of ordinary life is possible, and the same is true for our mental capacities. But there are three sectors of our existence in which it is easy to see how ambitions have expanded and changed the conditions of human life when compared with traditional social orders. These three sectors are relations between the sexes, relations between adults and children, and relations between different ethnic groups. The so-called feminist emancipation in Western countries has a long history, and it essentially concerns accommodations and changes in technology and society, changes that have deeply affected traditional patterns and conditions of life, especially in the family and in the professions. Thoroughgoing accommodations in feminine life have become more or less imperative. What has been decisive in principle, however, especially in these last decades in the West, has been the tendency to level out, even to efface the very differences between the sexes, and therewith inevitably comes conflict, not only between the sexes, but even within both sexes themselves. Following Rousseau, relations between adults and children have also entered a new phase. Rousseau's tale of Little Émile was, so to speak, a pedagogical sleeping beauty for 2 centuries. But recently, after World War II, his ideas, until now cultivated only by pedagogical extremists, have become widespread, and pretentious plans are being laid for new relationships between adult and child, between the ripe and the unripe. Democratic extremists now proclaim that pedagogical life will become an integral administration in the name of equality, already established in the workplace. It will be realized in conformity with the romantic, idyllic atmosphere of Rousseau's nature and the comradeship established between little Émile and his older pedagogical friend Jean-Jacques on the Savoyard farm. All of these pedagogical fantasies, introducing a premature citizenship in the schoolyard, cannot of course stand up to brutal reality. Nevertheless, we must be aware that the notion of eliminating all differences between the mature and the immature has already made great progress. Not least in this field is the fact that in Sweden, children have won a status of justice that puts definite limits on how adults can discipline and nurture children. World War II brought important changes in relations between the peoples of the earth. It marks an end to the colonial systems understood in the conventional sense. It also marks the beginning of open and unrestricted communication between the peoples of the world. Thousands of years of traditions formed in the matrix of ethnic and racial idiosyncrasies are thrust into the background. The dominant idea is that man is a universal creature formed by democratic egalitarianism. New institutions, new ethnic and aesthetic forms, and new political and social ideologies are implanted throughout the world. Manifestations of Western imperialism more effective and far-reaching than the older colonialisms ever were. The great hope in the Western world is that when all the peoples of the world meet in an atmosphere of democratic egalitarianism, there will be peace. Humanity will at long last realize the dream of 1789. This dream also had an element of hope. Common life will engender a kind of symbiosis, though just where the parameters of this symbiotic process are to be found is not clearly expressed.
What is undeniable today is that instincts of preservation must be overcome and assigned to lower barbaric periods. Modern man must be delivered from all forms of prejudice. Struggles for equality are often of value. They motivate and are even necessary for much in the human community as seen from the historical perspective. This much is undeniable, but equality as an integral, absolute foundation of society, as it is represented in the democratic myth, is something else altogether. Conceived in this way, equality is a denial of God's created order and also of the natural order, both of which have horizontal as well as vertical dimensions. Mankind is polarized into two sexes, and man and woman have distinct but complementary biological and psychological characteristics that cannot be eliminated without nefarious consequences. A human life is a process of maturation, and this life process does not admit that men and women, nor adults and children, are equivalent. A people, a nation, has an identity deeply rooted in its history, its language, its culture, its life forms, good and bad, and this community must be defended. What we call identity is always on guard against the cosmopolitan dissolution of norms. It is also, as Ernst Renan has said, a spiritual principle, une âme, un principe spirituel. Egalitarianism, in its modern absolutist form, attacks the divine order of creation, and it does so not only as a denial and repudiation of this order in its endless nuanced multiformity. In addition, the city of man demands a conformity in the widest sense of that word. The earth is populated by billions of men and women, and these human masses represent endless individual differences in bodily characteristics, in temperament, in intelligence, and in spiritual and cultural practices. But this diversity cannot be permitted in the city of man, where power and sovereignty rest not so much in the hands of the individual as in what is called the people, humanity, mankind. Sovereign man cannot reveal himself in such a diversified, manifold unfolding. The higher divine spectacle of man would not then be trustworthy. This is the pressure to conform that de Tocqueville observed during his renowned visit to the United States in the 1820s. But here we note that not only can we regard as twins the two archetypes, liberty and equality, of the democratic myth, but that they also exhibit a fundamental contradiction. Liberty is intrinsically nonconformist. It is bound to the ego both in its physical and psychic aspects. In its more passionate forms, liberty expresses a refractory narcissism, but in its essence, liberty is qualitative. Modernist equality, on the contrary, is conformist. It lacks quality because it is essentially quantitative, and its goal is to dominate and to establish an order. Egalitarianism is arithmetic. It can be realized statistically and can establish control and govern from central points of command. Equality subjugates, but liberty proclaims its invincibility. If the democratic myth were only a proclamation of liberty, the whole democratic construction, the whole edifice, would be thrown out of bounds and anarchy would result. Liberty, the fight for freedom, is an ego exaltation that gives man the possibility to exhibit his egoistic nakedness. Therefore, equality is a necessary counterbalance. But at the same time, equality is a menace for liberty. It can become a means of oppression in the hands of a central authority. When liberty and equality meet, therefore, conflict is unavoidable. This inner immanent contradiction exists in democracy. Who is winning and who is losing? When egalitarian demands for order and conformity gain the upper hand, what can the subtle and aristocratic value of liberty offer by way of resistance? In the one-dimensional city of man, equality dominates the landscape. Liberty has a psychic foundation, narcissism. Equality also has a psychic foundation, but one that is more exterior and more ignoble, namely resentment. the indefatigable struggle to undermine and bring down the superior, the strong, the high-minded, to gain power and influence by winning ascendancy for the inferior, and this is a potent weapon within democracy. An additional consideration is that resentment finds something lacking to liberty, namely, an additional source of moral energy. For equality always marches in lockstep with the notion of justice, even if the notion be erroneously conceived. Equality produces and continuously mobilizes moral energies. It is not difficult to understand what this moral production means for the democratic myth. This egalitarian morality has a double effect. It is simultaneously camouflage and manipulation. Egalitarian resentment and collective egoism are draped in moral elevation. Individual and collective egoism are elevated to the level of moral dignity. The democratic myth can be proclaimed in very good conscience. This moral system, however, is vulnerable. It is bound to earthly life and can certainly be the object of critical discrimination and analysis, of doubt and attack. One can assault a profane and egalitarian system of order even if it is presented as moral. But democracy is not only a system of earthly morality, it is something more. And in this something more, equality finds its way to triumph. Equality is righteousness. Equality raises us to a pseudo-metaphysical level where democracy and all it stands for are absolute, total, and boundless. In this world, man is the vehicle for this righteousness, and in the name of righteousness, man can proclaim himself as the legitimate sovereign possessor of all that we regard as terrestrial power. Part 11. In the edifice of the democratic myth, something is still lacking. To liberty and equality we must add a third element: power. In the traditional order, the source of power is God, the Almighty. In him power resides in its essence. All other power is derived from this essential power. God manifests himself in the creative process, if we may speak thus. Power in its essence is one and indivisible, but as an element in creation, power is seen as a duality. The possessor of power, the object toward which power is directed. Power and the exercise of power as elements of the world are manifested in innumerable areas and innumerable forms. It is to be found wherever organic life is found. Without power, nature would be delivered up to boundless chaos. We encounter power in cooperation, in struggle as structure, and in hierarchy. We also encounter power and its exercise in human civilized coexistence. Constitutionally, power is delegated by the Creator to human beings, and this is expressed symbolically and most lucidly in the traditional monarchical order where the king governs by the grace of God and is responsible before his celestial principle. The traditional idea of power means, therefore, that in the first place all power derives from essential power, that is, the divine source of power. Second, that the world is the field of manifestation of power. And third, that this power, in its worldly dualistic form, is nevertheless linked to essential power that flows from its divine source. Divinity, therefore, is also in the world as the judicial essence. In this we have the foundation for worldly power, and from this foundation we experience worldly power as authority, auctoritas. When we speak of the exercise of earthly power as erecting structures and creating order, as binding and commanding, as limiting and dominating, it is first of all not a question of the possession or usurpation of power in the physical sense, implying that a stronger suppresses a weaker. Terrestrial power has a qualitative content before all else, and this is because of the source of its derivation. Nothing that can be said of the brutal misuses of power that fill the history of mankind can contradict this. It only confirms the imperfection of everything earthly. In the West, the medieval period is full of conflicts revolving around the primacy of the spiritual authority and the exercise of secular power. In the Baroque states, debates about human nature are deeply involved in questions concerning the source of power. As secularist conceptions of earthly existence advance, power is regarded as a contract between the dominating and the dominated. But a duality remains, and Rousseau is the first artificially to separate the problem from all contact with reality. His solution is a fantastic and facile manipulation. Everyone exercises tyranny over everyone else. And this is a real revolution in human thinking regarding power. Rousseau proclaims that in its earthly manifestation, power is no longer to be regarded as a structural, binding, and hierarchical duality. Existence, and hence power, is one-dimensional. Power, in its earthly condition, consisting of divided sectors, is no more. Thousands of years of the expression of power, manifesting a spiritual and qualitative mission, auctoritas, is nothing else for Rousseau than the domination of the stronger, and this domination is essentially physical. La force est une puissance physique. No authority deriving from the divine source is to be found in Rousseau's one-dimensional system. The history of mankind, he says, is the history of flagrant injustice. He therefore begins his work on the social contract, contrat social, with the words "L'homme est né libre et partout il entend le faire." Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. I repeat, this is a revolution in human thinking. Rousseau here provides the philosophical foundation for Karl Marx. Power no longer has a higher source. It is now only physical. The qualitative has been replaced by the quantitative. Mankind is divided into two groups, the dominating and the dominated. But all of this will now be changed. Political power is placed in the hands of the people. All men are citizens, and they vote. Power is numerical, statistical. The many are stronger than the few. Does this mean that Rousseau has formulated a cynical theory of power, delivering mankind up to oppression in new and exquisite forms? No, indeed. According to Rousseau, the social contract brings men together, expressing something beyond individual interests. The social contract has an essence, and in understanding that essence, mankind unites personally with its energies in that higher meaning of citizenship, la volonté générale, the popular will. With the popular will, Rousseau completes his edifice, the democratic myth. This myth is brought to the fore by the men of 1945. Without this higher will, neither liberty nor equality is enough to erect the edifice of democracy. With the volonté générale, the people now have the means for auto-coronation. Now they win a pseudo-metaphysical exaltation. The people divinize themselves. Now the pressure for self-worship can be acknowledged. Now the golden calf can be brought out. Rousseau adds something else to this divinization. The will of the people invigorates. Popular power is, indeed, an unchangeable and exalted order, and the myth is in itself invincible. But the myth must give dynamism to the people, driving them to act, to change, to achieve. The people must will something. The democratic myth has a necessary postulate that we have a dynamism, that man in his individual as well as in his collective form must will something with his power. In the final analysis, what is it that we call popular democratic power? Beyond the express will of the people, as it is supposedly formulated, there is no appeal. Here we met the absolute, the universal, the indivisible, and the immovable. There is nothing a priori, nothing anterior to democratic power. No ideas of truth, no notions of good or bad.
can bind the popular will. This will is free in the sense that it stands above all notions of value. It is egalitarian because it is reared on the arithmetic equality. In the traditional order, there was a qualitative duality because there was a divine source of power, a higher will, that always allowed room for forgiveness, consolation, charity. The popular will knows none of this. Its sentences are implacable. It is not open to any appeal. It listens to no demand for grace, no plea for compassion. Like the Sphinx, the popular will is immovable in its enigmatic silence. The democratic myth is now complete in its sham Trinitarian unity. Mankind is free, equal, and almighty. Man lives in a one-dimensional world, under nothing superior. In this liberty, he can now exhibit his narcissism. In his equality, he finds his earthly moral justice, and in his power, he finds his divine perpetuity. What the Jacobins of 1789 proclaimed, but could not realize, is now preached by the men of 1945 and those who follow. The myth, now that all ideological fires are extinct, will compensate for the threat of emptiness. The two archetypes, liberty and equality, provide man his ego manifestation and his moral legitimation. And in the popular will, he discovers himself as a higher being, individually as well as collectively. He is the bearer of all earthly power. But the myth must now confront reality. Man now faces the world as the self-governing being that he believes himself to be, swollen with pride and afloat in ignorant self-esteem. No one can accuse, bring to trial, or judge a sovereign. Man is his own legislator, and as Rousseau emphasizes, what is highest is not the law, but the legislating, the law-giving will. And this law-giving will belongs to the subject, sovereign man. The logical conclusion can only be that man is without guilt, without sin, and what has been expressed as worship in the Christian sacrifice will now be replaced in the democratic myth by an existential guiltlessness. In the traditional order, an autocratic monarch could become a tyrant, repressing and obliterating all of his antagonists, but even a tyrant could be called to account for his crimes and for the violation of his solemn responsibilities. Even a tyrant lives and rules in a qualitative duality. There were always forces, always men who could assume responsibility and overthrow and displace him. The democratic myth effaces objectivity and duality. This is what it means to live in universal subjectivity, in a non-contradictory seclusion. When secularized man confronts this solitary subjectivity, a crisis arises. Man meets himself, and no one can be unconscious of the limits of human capacity. Even if the city of man denies this, the consciousness of guilt nevertheless exists as an element in human self-awareness. Heidegger tries to explain it, but he does not deny it. This consciousness does not diminish, rather, it is increasing because secularized man lacks something of great value that traditional man possessed, the possibility of forgiveness, of grace and caritas. Absolutized democracy closes the door on this way of transcendence and egress. Man must now confront his guilt. Now begins what Kafka called the process. Now the great philosopher of the city of man, Martin Heidegger, confirms that the existential stream of time includes guilt, and that man is necessarily involved with fear and anxiety. But does not modern man have a great compensation in citizenship? Is not citizenship the great human assumption of responsibility and social morality? Actually, the father of universal citizenship, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, has abolished the foundations of this citizenship because he proclaims the unidimensionality of popular sovereignty. For Rousseau, the highest norm is not law, the highest norm is the will of man, above which nothing can be admitted. But genuine citizenship is realized only on condition that man accepts an order of virtue that is superior to him, which is expressed as a manifestation of heavenly norms and of heavenly power over him. Unidimensionality annihilates the possibility of virtue. The concept of citizenship in aristocratic times was a fascinating ideal and goal. Today, when men live as if in a hall of mirrors and in subjective seduction, they behave as de Tocqueville observed during his American tour. Nowhere is man so insignificant as in a democracy. Democratic man flatters himself, but he cannot shut out an awareness of his real situation. He has placed himself squarely within the process of secularization and must recognize that now he is nothing more than the sum of psychophysical functions in the universal existential flux. In effect, nothing more than a welter of chaotic and fleeting sensory impressions. Democratic man cannot escape the experience of powerlessness. It is a curious fact that nothing makes democratic man so confused, even irritated, as calling his attention to the enormous power that he is said to possess. He does not deny the principle of popular sovereignty, but it lurks in the shadows as a kind of half-conscious power held in reserve, one that we are supposed to bring out into the light and defend when authoritarian dangers threaten. On such occasions, one observes a state of excitement, of collective narcissism. But this reaction must be seen as a means of self-assurance and not at all as an expression of a consciousness of dignity and power. Concealing, veiling, or maneuvering around the sense of powerlessness is commonly accomplished through escapism, and the avenues of escape are basically two. Sancho Panza is the classical literary figure illustrating one of these. His master, Don Quixote, has promised the little squire that he will be made governor of an island, but if he should find the power and responsibility too onerous, he can always find an exit. He can lease it out. And Cervantes lets the reader know that when Sancho Panza finally finds that his governorship is in fact too heavy for him, he is overtaken by real fear, and with deep gratitude he returns to reality and to his simple role as servant. Sancho Panza returns to his private life. Countless are the multitudes of men who go the same way. Private life is found to be the great territory for escape, where men can rest and be delivered from the yoke of almighty democracy. The modern social state helps, offering excellent possibilities and all of the needed guarantees of welfare and security, that umbrella under which private man can live. Even Marxist-Leninist systems led to the paradoxical situation of the great mass of inhabitants, Soviet men, striving more and more for purely private interests under a growing, flourishing power of people's commissars. The retreat into private life is one of the main avenues of escapism. It is the passive expression of the experience of powerlessness. But another way of escapism expresses a more active and compensatory attitude. This is when people experience great democratic leadership, the charismatic aspect of the democratic myth. Powerlessness is never better concealed than when people place themselves in the shadow of a great leader, those momentous personas with whom the people can identify. There are almost no limits to the generosity and the hopes, but also to the deceptions that the democratic masses invest in their leaders, their father figures. The self-esteem of the masses is here raised to sublime heights. If the possibilities of identification between the leaders and their followers are sufficiently strong, then every feeling of powerlessness is obliterated. Moreover, the notion of popular sovereignty is never undermined for those adorers, even when confronted with confessions of deception and failure from the master himself. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in a frank declaration about the social contract, wrote that a real democracy has never existed and will never exist, because such a state of affairs is against the order of nature. The great mass of men can never bear the governing power. Il ne jamais existe de véritable démocratie, et il n'en existerait jamais. Il est contre l'ordre naturel que le grand nombre gouverne. In this fit of candor, Rousseau was in full accord with the scholastic adage that nihil agit in se ipsum, nothing acts upon itself. In democratic leadership, we see manipulation and the psychological phenomenon of projection at the highest level. The leader will be the incarnation of the volonté générale, the bearer and executor of what is said to be the people's inner will. These strong and charismatic leading figures are the magnified images of what the masses want to be themselves. The leader is the mirror, delivering man from the perceptions of his own powerlessness and insufficiency. He is the father figure, giving to his adherents what they believe is the real popular will. Part 12. The outcome of the Second World War is not only a military victory in the conventional sense, it is also a victory in an inner sense. Mankind is confronted with good and bad, with a choice between fascism, which is bad, and the order proclaimed by the victors, which is, by definition, good. This proclamation itself has a more anterior meaning, the denial in principle and the annihilation of the traditional order. It means the denial of more than 1,000 years of energy directed toward moral and spiritual ends, the inner content of the traditional. Ideologically expressed, it means the annihilation of conservatism. The dispositions that found expression in the proclamation of victory in 1945 can also be expressed in Trinitarian terms: the city of man, modernism, democracy. The city of man confirms the omnipotence that free and equal man, in his endless one-dimensionality, has granted to himself, to deny or to doubt which is blasphemy. No longer can any power set limits to human omnipotence. No responsibility need be vindicated for transgressing any borders, for mirabile dictu, there are no longer any borders. The city of man is total godlessness. It is the pseudo-metaphysical dimension of this trinity. The world, dominated by man, everlasting in time and endless in space, is an existential flux without origin and without goal. For man, nothing else is left but to be identical with himself. Willy-nilly, whether he intends it or not, he is enclosing himself within an autism of his own making. He can no longer surpass himself, no longer pass out of the prison of his ego. His own prisoner, he finds compensation in the narcissistic reflected images of himself and of his idols. In a subjectivism that is without horizons and timeless, he can no longer give an objective answer to his own questions. If he asks questions, he is only throwing himself into his own arms, as the existentialist theologian Bultmann said. In this state, when the historical also loses its meaning, we encounter the existential dimension of this unholy trinity, modernism. How is omnipotent man using his power in his city? In this existential flux, there are no stable points, no supports.
The absolute is replaced by the relative. The qualitative is replaced by the quantitative. In the art of governing, man has a new means of administration, statistics, and a means of power, voting. The world is placed, willy-nilly, under a principle of power. More implacable than God's will under a millennial creed is the present domination of the majority over the minority. For God's will was always linked with caritas, with forgiveness, grace, and compassion. The will of the majority, on the contrary, is unconditional. It requires unconditional surrender. To the pseudo-metaphysical dimension of this trinity, the city of man, and to its existential dimension, modernism, we must now add a third, naked political and physical power, democracy. For in this modernistic, democratic city of man, we must vote on everything, even on virtue and righteousness. And what then of the righteous minorities? If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description.
If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos.
If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack. Link also in the description.